Prefatory Note of the Intermediate Sex, a study of some transitional types of men and women, by Edward Carpenter. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit librivox.org. Recording by Chuck Williamson. The Intermediate Sex, a study of some transitional types of men and women. There are transitional forms between the metals and non-metals, between chemical combinations and simple mixtures, between animals and plants, between phanerogams and cryptogams, and between mammals and birds. The improbability may henceforth be taken for granted of finding in nature a sharp cleavage between all that is masculine on the one side and all that is feminine on the other, or that any living being is so simple in this respect that it can be put wholly on one side or wholly on the other of the line. O. Weininger. Prefatory Note to the First Edition. The following papers, now collected in book form, have been written, and some of them published, on various occasions during the last 12 or 14 years, and in the intervals of other work. And this must be my excuse for occasional repetitions or overlapping of matter, which may be observable among them. I have thought it best, however, to leave them as they stand, as in this way each is more complete in itself. The second essay, which gives its title to the book, has already appeared in my Love's Coming of Age, edition 1906, but is reprinted here as belonging more properly to this volume. A collection of quotations from responsible writers, who touch on various sides of the subject, is added at the end to form an appendix, which the author thinks will prove helpful, though he does not necessarily endorse all the opinions presented. E.C. End of Prefatory Note. Chapter 1 of the Intermediate Sex, a study of some transitional types of men and women, by Edward Carpenter. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Chuck Williamson. Chapter 1 Introductory. The subject dealt with in this book is one of great, and one may say growing, importance. Whether it is that the present period is one of large increase in the numbers of men and women of an intermediate or mixed temperament, or whether it merely is that it is a period in which more than usual attention happens to be accorded to them, the fact certainly remains that the subject has great actuality and is pressing upon us from all sides. It is recognized that, anyhow, the number of persons occupying an intermediate position between the two sexes is very great, that they play a considerable part in general society, and that they necessarily present and embody many problems which, both for their own sake and that of society, demand solution. The literature of the question has, in consequence, already grown to be quite extensive, especially on the continent, and includes a great quantity of scientific works, medical treatises, literary essays, romances, historical novels, poetry, etc. And it is now generally admitted that some knowledge and enlightened understanding of the subject is greatly needed for the use of certain classes, as, for instance, medical men, teachers, parents, magistrates, judges, and the like. that there are distinctions and gradations of soul material in relation to sex, that the inner psychical affections and affinities shade off and graduate, in a vast number of instances, most subtly from male to female, and not always in obvious correspondence with the outer bodily sex, is a thing evident enough to anyone who considers the subject. Nor could any good purpose well be served by ignoring this fact, even if it were possible to do so. It is easy, of course, as some do, to classify these mixed or intermediate types as bad. It is also easy, as some do, to argue that, just because they combine opposite qualities, they are likely to be good and valuable. But the subtleties and complexities of nature cannot be dispatched in this offhand manner. The great probability is that, as in many other class of human beings, there will be among these two good and bad, high and low, worthy and unworthy. Some perhaps exhibiting, through their double temperament, a rare and beautiful flower of humanity, others a perverse and tangled ruin. Before the facts of nature, we have to preserve a certain humility and reverence, nor rush in with our preconceived and obstinate assumptions. Though these gradations of human type have always, and among all peoples, been more or less known and recognized, yet their frequency today, or even the concentration of attention on them, may be the indication of some important change actually in progress. We do not know, in fact, what possible evolutions are to come, or what new forms of permanent place and value are being already slowly differentiated from the surrounding mass of humanity. It may be, as at some past period of evolution the worker bee was without doubt differentiated from the two ordinary bee sexes, so at the present time certain new types of humankind may be emerging, which will have an important part to play in the societies of the future, even though for the moment their appearance is attended by a good deal of confusion and misapprehension. It may be so, or it may not. We do not know, and the best attitude we can adopt is one of sincere and dispassionate observation of facts. Of course, wherever this subject touches on the domain of love, we may expect difficult queries to arise. Yet it is here probably that the noblest work of the intermediate sex or sexes will be accomplished, as well as the greatest errors committed. It seems almost a law of nature that new and important movements should be misunderstood and vilified, even though afterwards they may be widely approved or admitted to honor. Such movements are always envisioned first from whatever aspect they may possibly present, of ludicrous or contemptible. The early Christians, in the eyes of the Romans, were chiefly known as the perpetrators of obscure rites and crimes in the darkness of the catacombs. Modern socialism was, for a long time, supposed to be an affair of daggers and dynamite. And even now there are thousands of good people, ignorant enough to believe that it simply means divide up all round and take each his 3-penny bit. Vegetarians were supposed to be a feeble and brainless set of cabbage eaters. The women's movement, so vast in its scope and importance, was nothing but an absurd attempt to make women the apes of men. And so on without end, the accusations in each case being some tag or last fag end of fact, caught up by ignorance and colored by prejudice. So commonplace is it to misunderstand, so easy to misrepresent, that the Uranian temperament, especially in regards to its affectional side, is not without faults, must naturally be allowed, but that it has been grossly and absurdly misunderstood is certain. With a good deal of experience in the matter, I think one may safely say that the defect of the male Uranian, or Urning, is not sensuality, but rather sentimentality. The lower, more ordinary type of Urning are often terribly sentimental. The superior type, strangely, almost incredibly emotional. But neither, as a rule, though of course there must be exceptions, are so sensual as the average normal man. This immense capacity of emotional love represents, of course, a great driving force. Whether in the individual or in society, love is eminently creative. It is their great genius of attachment which gives to the best Uranian types their penetrating influence and activity, and which often makes them beloved and accepted far and wide, even by those who know nothing of their inner mind. How many so-called philanthropists of the best kind, we need not mention names, have been inspired by the Uranian temperament, the world will probably never know. And in all walks of life, the great number and influence of folk of this disposition, and the distinguished place they already occupy, is only realized by those who are more or less behind the scenes. It is probable also that it is this genius for emotional love which gives the Uranians their remarkable youthfulness. Anyhow, with their extraordinary gift for and experience in affairs of the heart, from the double point of view, both of the man and of the woman, it is not difficult to see that these people have a special work to do, as reconcilers and interpreters of the two sexes to each other. Of this I have spoken at more length below, chapters 2 and 5. It is probable that the superior yearnings will become, in affairs of the heart, to a large extent the teachers of future society, and if so, that their influence will tend to the realization and expression of an attachment less exclusively sensual than to the average today, and to the diffusion of this in all directions. While at any rate not presuming to speak with authority on so difficult a subject, I plead for the necessity of a patient consideration of it, for the due recognition of the type of character concerned, and for some endeavor to give them their fitting place and sphere of usefulness in the general scheme of society. One thing more by way of introductory explanation. The word love is commonly used in so general and almost indiscriminate a fashion as to denote sometimes physical instincts and acts, and sometimes the most intimate and profound feelings, and in this way a good deal of misunderstanding is caused. In this book, unless there be exceptions in the appendix, the word is used to denote the inner devotion of one person to another, and when anything else is meant, as, for instance, sexual relations and actions, this is clearly stated and expressed. End of Chapter 1. Chapter 2 of the Intermediate Sex, a study of some transitional types of men and women. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit librivox.org. Recording by Chuck Williamson. The Intermediate Sex, a study of some transitional types of men and women, by Edward Carpenter. Chapter 2. The Intermediate Sex. Earning men and women, on whose book of life nature has written her new word, which sounds so strange to us, bear such storm and stress within them, such ferment and fluctuation, so much complex material having its outlet only towards the future. Their individualities are so rich and many-sided, and withal so little understood, that it is impossible to characterize them adequately in a few sentences. Auto de jus. In late years, and since the arrival of the new woman amongst us, many things in the relation of men and women to each other have altered, or at any rate become clearer. The growing sense of equality in habits and customs, university studies, art, music, politics, the bicycle, etc. All these things have brought about a rapprochement between the sexes. If the modern woman is a little more masculine in some ways than her predecessor, the modern man, it is to be hoped, while by no means effeminate, is a little more sensitive in temperament and artistic in feeling than the original John Bull. It is beginning to be recognized that the sexes do not or should not normally form two groups hopelessly isolated in habit and feeling from each other, but that they rather represent the two poles of one group, which is the human race. So that while certainly the extreme specimens at either pole are vastly divergent, there are great numbers in the middle region who, though differing corporeally as men and women, are by emotion and temperament very near to each other. We all know women with a strong dash of the masculine temperament, and we all know men whose almost feminine sensibility and intuition seem to belie their bodily form. Nature, it might appear, in mixing the elements which go to compose each individual, does not always keep her two groups of ingredients, which represent the two sexes, properly apart, but often throws them crosswise in a somewhat baffling manner, now this way and now that. Yet wisely we must think, for if a severe distinction of elements were always maintained, the two sexes would soon drift into far latitudes and absolutely cease to understand each other. As it is, there are some remarkable and, we think, indispensable types of character in whom there is such a union or balance of the feminine and masculine qualities that these people become to a great extent the interpreters of men and women to each other. There is another point which has almost become clearer of late. For as people are beginning to see that the sexes form in a certain sense a continuous group, so they are beginning to see that love and friendship, which have been so often set apart from each other as things distinct, are in reality closely related and shade imperceptibly into one another. Women are beginning to demand that marriage shall mean friendship as well as passion, that a comrade-like equality shall be included in the word love, and it is recognized that from the one extreme of platonic friendship, generally between persons of the same sex, up to the other extreme of passionate love, generally between persons of opposite sex, no hard and fast line can at any point be drawn effectively separating the different kinds of attachment. We know, in fact, of friendships so romantic in sentiment that they verge into love. We know of love so intellectual and spiritual that they hardly dwell in the sphere of passion. A moment's thought will show that the general conceptions indicated above, if anywhere near the truth, point to an immense diversity of human temperament and character in matters relating to sex and love. But though such diversity has probably always existed, it has only in comparatively recent times become an object of study. More than 30 years ago, however, an Austrian writer, K. H. Ulrichs, drew attention in a series of pamphlets, Memnon, Araspe, Inclusa, etc., to the existence of a class of people who strongly illustrate the above remarks, and with whom specially this paper is concerned. He pointed out that there were people born in such a position, as it were on the dividing line between the sexes, that while belonging distinctly to one sex as far as their bodies are concerned, they may be said to belong mentally and emotionally to the other. That there might be men, for instance, who might be described as a feminine soul enclosed in a male body, anima molebris in corpore virile inclusa, or in other cases, women whose definition would be just the reverse. And he maintained that this doubleness of nature was to a great extent proved by the special direction of their love sentiment. For in such cases, as indeed might be expected, the apparently masculine person, instead of forming a love union with a female, tended to contract romantic friendships with one of his own sex, while the apparently feminine would, instead of marrying in the usual way, devote herself to the love of another feminine. People of this kind, i.e., having the special variation of the love sentiment, he called Urnings. Footnote: from Uranos, heaven, his idea being that the Uranian love was of a higher order than the ordinary attachment. End footnote. And though we are not obliged to accept his theory about the crosswise connection between body and soul, since at best these words are somewhat vague and indefinite, yet his work was important because it was one of the first attempts in modern times to recognize the existence of what might be called an intermediate sex, and to give at any rate some explanation of it. Footnote: Charles G. Leland, Hans Breitmann, in his book The Alternate Sex, Welby, 1904, insists much on the frequent combination of the characteristics of both sexes in remarkable men and women, and has a chapter on the female mind in man, and another on the male intellect in women. End footnote. Since that time, the subject has been widely studied and written about by scientific men and others, especially on the continent, though in England it is still comparatively unknown, and by means of an extended observation of present-day cases, as well as the indirect testimony of the history and literature of past times, quite a body of general conclusions has been arrived at, of which I propose in the following pages to give some slight account. Contrary to the general impression, one of the first points that emerges from this study is that Urnings or Uranians are by no means so very rare, but that they form, beneath the surface of society, a large class. It remains difficult, however, to get an exact statement of their numbers, and this for more than one reason. Partly because, owing to the want of any general understanding of their case, these folk tend to conceal their true feelings from all but their own kind, and indeed often deliberately act in such a manner as to lead the whole world astray. whence it arises that a normal man living in a certain society will often refuse to believe that there is a single Urning in the circle of his acquaintances, while one of the latter, or one that understands the nature, living in the same society, can count perhaps a score or more. And partly because it is indubitable that the numbers do vary very greatly, not only in different countries, but even in the different classes in the same country. The consequences of all this being that we have estimates differing very widely from each other. Dr. Grabowski, a well-known writer in Germany, quotes figures which we must think must be exaggerated, as high as 1 man in every 22, while Dr. Albert Moll, De Contrare Sexualimfundum, Chapter 3, gives estimates varying from 1 in every 50 to as low as 1 in every 500. These figures apply to such as are exclusively of the said nature, i.e., to those whose deepest feelings of love and friendship go out only to persons of their own sex. Of course, if in addition are included those double-natured people, of whom there is a great number, who experience the normal attachment with the homogenic tendency in less or greater degrees superadded, the estimates must be greatly higher. In the second place, it emerges, also contrary to the general impression, that men and women of the exclusively Uranian type are by no means necessarily morbid in any way, unless, indeed, their peculiar temperament be pronounced in itself morbid. Formerly, it was assumed as a matter of course that the type was merely a result of disease and degeneration. But now, with the examination of the actual facts, it appears that, on the contrary, many are fine, healthy specimens of their sex, muscular and well-developed in body, of powerful brain, high standards of conduct, and with nothing abnormal or morbid of any kind observable in their physical structure or constitution. This is of course not true of all, and there still remain a certain number of cases of weakly type to support the neuropathic view. Yet it is very noticeable that this view is much less insisted on by the later writers than by the earlier. It is also worth noticing that it is now acknowledged that even in the most healthy cases, the special affectional temperament of the intermediate is, as a rule, ineradicable. So much so that when, as in not a few instances, such men and women from social or other considerations have forced themselves to marry and even have children, they have still not been able to overcome their own bias, or the leaning, after all, of their life attachment to some friend of their own sex. This subject, though obviously one of considerable interest and importance, has been hitherto, as I have pointed out, but little discussed in this country, partly owing to a certain amount of doubt and distrust which has, not unnaturally perhaps, surrounded it. And certainly, if the men and women born with the tendency in question were only exceedingly rare, though it would not be fair on that account to ignore them, yet it would hardly be necessary to dwell at great length on their case. But as the class is really on any computation numerous, it becomes a duty for society not only to understand them, but to help them to understand themselves. For there is no doubt that, in many cases, people of this kind suffer a great deal from their own temperament, and yet, after all, it is possible that they may have an important part to play in the evolution of the race. Anyone who realizes what love is, the dedication of the heart, so profound, so absorbing, so mysterious, so imperative, and always just in the noblest natures so strong, cannot fail to see how difficult, how tragic even, must often be the fate of those whose deepest feelings are destined from the earliest days to be a riddle or a stumbling block, unexplained to themselves, passed over in silence by others. To call people of such temperament morbid and so forth is of no use. Such a term is, in fact, absurdly inapplicable to many who are among the most active, the most amiable and accepted members of society. Besides, it forms no solution of the problem in question, and only amounts to marking down for disparagement a fellow creature who has already considerable difficulties to contend with. Says Dr. Moll, quote, "Anyone who has seen many Urnings will probably admit that they form a by no means enervated human group. On the contrary, one finds powerful, healthy-looking folk among them." End quote. But in the next sentence he says that they suffer severely from the way they are regarded. And in the manifesto of a considerable community of such people in Germany occur these words, quote, "The rays of sunshine in the night of our existence are so rare that we are responsive and deeply grateful for the least movement, for every single voice that speaks in our favor in the forum of mankind." End quote. In dealing with this class of folk, then, while I do not deny that they present a difficult problem, I think that just for that very reason their case needs discussion. It would be a great mistake to suppose that their attachments are necessarily sexual or connected with sexual acts. On the contrary, as abundant evidence shows, they are often purely emotional in their character, and to confuse Uranians, as is often done, with libertines having no law but curiosity and self-indulgence is to do them a great wrong. At the same time, it is evident that their special temperament may sometimes cause them difficulty in regard to their sexual relations. Into the subject we need not just now enter, but we may point out how hard it is, especially for the young among them, that a veil of complete silence should be drawn over the subject, leading to the most painful misunderstandings and perversions and confusions of mind, and that there should be no hint of guidance, nor any recognition of the solitary and really serious inner struggles that they may have to face. If the problem is a difficult one, as it undoubtedly is, the fate of these people is already hard who have to meet it in their own persons, without their suffering in addition from the refusal of society to give them any help. It is partly for these reasons, and to throw a little light where it may be needed, that I have thought it might be advisable in this paper simply to give a few characteristics of the intermediate types. As indicated then already, in bodily structure there is, as a rule, nothing to distinguish the subjects of our discussion from ordinary men and women. But if we take the general mental characteristics, it appears from almost universal testimony that the male tends to be of a rather gentle, emotional disposition, with defects, if such exist, in the direction of subtlety, evasiveness, timidity, vanity, etc., while the female is just the opposite, fiery, active, bold, and truthful, with defects running to brusqueness and coarseness. Moreover, the mind of the former is generally intuitive and instinctive in its perceptions, with more or less of artistic feeling, while the mind of the latter is more logical, scientific, and precise than usual with the normal woman. So marked indeed are these general characteristics that sometimes, by means of them, though not an infallible guide, the nature of the boy or girl can be detected in childhood before full development has taken place, and needless to say, it may often be very important to be able to do this. It was no doubt in consequence of the observation of these signs that K.H. Ulrichs proposed his theory. And though the theory, as we have said, does not by any means meet all the facts, still, it is perhaps not without merit, and may be worth bearing in mind. In the case, for instance, of a woman of this temperament, defined, we suppose, as a male soul in a female body, the theory helps us to understand how it might be possible for her to fall bona fide in love with another woman. Krafft-Ebing gives the case of a lady A, 28 years of age, who fell deeply in love with a younger one, B. I loved her divinely, she said. They lived together, and the union lasted 4 years, but was broken by the marriage of B. A suffered in consequence from frightful depression, but in the end, though without real love, got married herself. Her depression, however, only increased and deepened into illness. The doctors, when consulted, said that all would be well if she would only have a child. The husband, who loved his wife sincerely, could not understand her enigmatic behavior. She was friendly to him, suffered his caresses, but for days afterwards remained dull, exhausted, plagued with irritation of the spine, and nervous. Presently, a journey of the married pair led to another meeting with the female friend, who had now been wedded, but also unhappily, for 3 years. Quote, both ladies trembled with joy and excitement as they fell into each other's arms, and were thenceforth inseparable. The man found that this friendship relation was a singular one, and hastened the departure. When the opportunity occurred, he convinced himself from the correspondence between his wife and her friend that their letters were exactly like those of 2 lovers. End quote. It appears that the loves of such women are often very intense, and, as also in the case of male earnings, lifelong. Both classes feel themselves blessed when they love happily. Nevertheless, to many of them, it is a painful fact that, in consequence of their peculiar temperament, they are, though fond of children, not in possession to found a family. We have so far limited ourselves to some very general characteristics of the intermediate race. It may help to clear and fix our ideas if we now describe more in detail, first, what may be called the extreme and exaggerated types of the race, and then the more normal and perfect types. By doing so, we shall get a more definite and concrete view of our subject. In the first place, then, the extreme specimens, as in most cases of extremes, are not particularly attractive, sometimes quite the reverse. In the male of this kind, we have a distinctly effeminate type, sentimental, lackadaisical, mincing in gait and manners, something of a chatterbox, skillful at the needle and in women's work, sometimes taking pleasure in dressing in woman's clothes, his figure not unfrequently betraying a tendency towards the feminine, large at the hips, supple, not muscular, the face wanting in hair, the voice inclining to be high-pitched, etc., while his dwelling-room is orderly in the extreme, even natty, and choice of decoration and perfume. His affection, too, is often feminine in character, clinging, dependent, and jealous, as of one desiring to be loved almost more than to love. Footnote: a good deal of this description may remind readers of history of the habits and character of Henry III of France. End footnote. On the other hand, as the extreme type of homogenic female, we have a rather markedly aggressive person, of strong passions, masculine manners and movements, practical in the conduct of life, sensuous rather than sentimental in love, often untidy and outre in attire. Footnote: perhaps like Queen Christine of Sweden, who rode across Europe on her visit to Italy in jackboots and sitting astride of her horse. It is said that she shook the Pope's hand on seeing him so heartily that the doctor had to attend to it afterwards. End footnote. Her figure muscular, her voice rather low in pitch, her dwelling-room decorated with sporting scenes, pistols, etc., and not without a suspicion of the fragrant weed in the atmosphere, while her love, generally to rather soft and feminine specimens of her own sex, is often a sort of furor, similar to the ordinary masculine love, and at times almost uncontrollable. These are types which, on account of their salience, everyone will recognize more or less. Naturally, when they occur, they excite a great deal of attention, and it is not an uncommon impression that most persons of the homogenic nature belong to either one or other of these classes. But, in reality, of course, these extreme developments are rare, and for the most part, the temperament in question is embodied in men and women of quite normal and unsensational exterior. Speaking of this subject and the connection between effeminateness and the homogenic nature in men, Dr. Moll says, quote, "It is, however, as well to point out at the outset that effeminacy does not by any means show itself in all earnings. Though one may find this or that indication in a great number of cases, yet it cannot be denied that a very large percentage, perhaps by far the majority of them, do not exhibit pronounced effeminacy." End quote. And it may be supposed that we may draw the same conclusion with regard to women of this class, namely, that the majority of them do not exhibit pronounced masculine habits. In fact, while these extreme cases are of the greatest value from a scientific point of view, as marking tendencies and limits of developments in certain directions, it would be a serious mistake to look upon them as representative cases of the whole phases of human evolution concerned. If now we come to what may be called the more normal type of the Uranian man, we find a man who, while possessing thoroughly masculine powers of mind and body, combines with them the tenderer and more emotional soul nature of the woman, and sometimes to a remarkable degree. Such men, as said, are often muscular and well-built, and not distinguishable in exterior structure and the carriage of body from others of their own sex. But emotionally they are extremely complex, tender, sensitive, pitiful, and loving, full of storm and stress, of ferment and fluctuation of the heart. The logical faculty may or may not in their case be well developed, but intuition is always strong. Like women, they read characters at a glance, and knowing without knowing how what is passing in the minds of others. For nursing and waiting on the needs of others, they have often a peculiar gift. At the bottom lies the artist's nature, with the artist's sensibility and perception. Such an one is often a dreamer, of brooding, reserved habits, often a musician, or a man of culture, courted in society, which nevertheless does not understand him, though sometimes a child of the people, without any culture, but almost always with a peculiar inborn refinement. Dejoux, who speaks on the whole favorably of Uranian men and women, says of the former, quote, "They are enthusiastic for poetry and music, are often eminently skillful in the fine arts, and are overcome with emotion and sympathy at the least sad occurrence. Their sensitiveness, their endless tenderness for children, their love of flowers, their great pity for beggars and crippled folk, are truly womanly." End quote. And in another passage he indicates the artist's nature when he says, quote, "The nerve system of many a yearning is the finest and most complicated musical instrument in the service of the interior personality that can be imagined." End quote. It would seem probable that the attachment of such a one is of a tender and profound character. Indeed, it is possible that, in this class of men, we have the love sentiment in one of its most perfect forms, a form in which, from the necessities of the situation, the sensuous element, though present, is exquisitely subordinated to the spiritual. Says one writer on this subject, a Swiss, quote, "Happy indeed is that man who has won a real yearning for his friend. He walks on roses, without ever having to fear the thorns." End quote. And he adds, quote, "Can there be a more perfect sick nurse than a yearning?" End quote. And though these are ex parte utterances, we may believe there is an appreciable grain of truth in them. Another writer, quoted by Dejoux, speaks to somewhat the same effect, and may perhaps be received in a similar spirit. Quote, "We form," he says, "a peculiar aristocracy of modern spirits, of good and refined habit, and in many masculine circles are the representatives of the higher mental and artistic element. In us dreamers and enthusiasts lie the continual counterpoise to the sheer masculine portion of society, inclining, as it always does, to mere restless greed of gain and material, sensual pleasures. That men of this kind despise women, though a not uncommon belief, is one which hardly appears to be justified. Indeed, though naturally not inclined to fall in love in this direction, such men are by their nature drawn rather near to women, and it would seem that they often feel a singular appreciation and understanding of the emotional needs and destinies of the other sex, leading in many cases to a genuine, though what is called platonic, friendship. There is little doubt that they are often instinctively sought after by women, who, without suspecting the real cause, are conscious of a sympathetic chord in the homogenic, which they miss in the normal man. To quote Dejoux once more, quote, "It would be a mistake to suppose that all Urnings must be woman-haters. Quite the contrary. They are not seldom the faithfulest friends, the truest allies, the most convinced defenders of women." End quote. To come now to the more normal and perfect specimens of the homogenic woman, we find a type in which the body is thoroughly feminine and gracious, with the roundure and fullness of the female form, and the continence and aptness of its movements, but in which the inner nature is to a great extent masculine, a temperament active, brave, originative, somewhat decisive, not too emotional, fond of outdoor life, of games and sports, of science, politics, or even business, good at organization and well pleased with positions of responsibility, sometimes indeed making an excellent and generous leader. Such a woman, it is easily seen from her special combination of qualities, is often fitted for remarkable work in professional life, or as manageress of institutions, or even as ruler of a country. Her love goes out to younger and more feminine natures than her own. It is a powerful passion, almost of a heroic type, and capable of inspiring to great deeds, and when held duly in leash may sometimes become an invaluable force in the teaching and training of girlhood, or in the creation of a school of thought or action among women. Many a Santa Clara or abbess founder of religious houses has probably been a woman of this type, and in all times such women, not being bound to men by the ordinary ties, have been able to work the more freely for the interests of their sex, a cause to which their own temperament impels them to devote themselves con amore. I have now sketched, very briefly and inadequately, it is true, both the extreme types and the more healthy types of the intermediate man and woman, types which may be verified from history and literature, though more certainly and satisfactorily, perhaps, from actual life around us. And unfamiliar though the subject is, it begins to appear that it is one which modern thought and science will have to face. Of the latter and more normal types, it may be said that they exist, and that they have always existed, in considerable abundance, and from that circumstance alone there is a strong probability that they have their place and purpose. As pointed out, there is no particular indication of morbidity about them, unless the special nature of their love sentiment be itself accounted morbid. And in the alienation of the sexes from each other, of which complaint is often made today, it must be admitted that they do much to fill the gap. The instinctive artistic nature of the male of this class, his sensitive spirit, his wave-like, emotional temperament, combined with hardihood of intellect and body, and the frank free nature of the female, her masculine independence and strength wedded to thoroughly feminine grace of form and manner, may be said to give them both, through their double nature, command of life in all its phases, and a certain freemasonry of the secrets of the two sexes, which may well favor their function as reconcilers and interpreters. Certainly, it is remarkable that some of the world's greatest leaders and artists have been dowered either wholly or in part with the Uranian temperament, as in the cases of Michelangelo, Shakespeare, Marlowe, Alexander the Great, Julius Caesar, or among women, Christine of Sweden, Sappho the poetess, and others. End of Chapter 2. Chapter 3 of the Intermediate Sex, a study of some transitional types of men and women. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit librivox.org. Recording by Chuck Williamson. The Intermediate Sex, a study of some transitional types of men and women, by Edward Carpenter. Chapter 3. The Homogenic Attachment. In its various forms, so far as we know them, love seems always to have a deep significance and a most practical importance to us little mortals. In one form, as the mere semi-conscious sex love, which runs through creation and is common to the lowest animals and plants, it appears as a kind of organic basis for the unity of all creatures. In another, as the love of the mother for her offspring, which may also be termed a passion, it seems to pledge itself to the care and guardianship of the future race. In another, as the marriage of man and woman, it becomes the very foundation of human society. And so we can hardly believe that, in its homogenic form, with which we are here concerned, it has not also a deep significance and social uses and functions, which will become clearer to us the more we study it. To some, perhaps, it may appear a little strained to place this last-mentioned form of attachment on a level of importance with the others, and such persons may be inclined to deny that the homogenic or homosexual love, that intense, that penetrating, and at times overmastering character, which would entitle it to rank as a great human passion. But in truth, this view, when entertained, arises from a want of acquaintance with the actual facts, and it may not be amiss here, in the briefest possible way, to indicate what the world's history, literature, and art has to say to us on this aspect of the subject, before going on to further considerations. Certainly, if the confronting of danger and endurance of pain and distress for the sake of the loved one, if sacrifice, unwavering devotion, and lifelong union constitute proofs of the reality and intensity, and let us say healthiness, of an affection, then these proofs have been given in numberless cases of such attachment, not only as existing between men, but as between women since the world began. The records of chivalric love, the feats of enamored knights for their ladies' sakes, the stories of Hero and Leander, etc., are easily paralleled, if not surpassed, by the stories of the Greek comrades in arms and tyrannicides, of Cratinus and Aristodemus, who offered themselves together as a voluntary sacrifice for the purification of Athens, of Chariton and Melanippus, who attempted to assassinate Phalaris, the tyrant of Agrigentum, or of Cleomachus, who, in like manner, in a battle between the Chalcidians and Erythraeans, being entreated to charge the latter, quote, asked the youth he loved, who was standing by, whether he would be a spectator of the fight, and when he said he would, and affectionately kissed Cleomachus, and put his helmet on his head, Cleomachus, with a proud joy, placed himself in the front of the bravest of the Thessalians, and charged the enemy's cavalry with such impetuosity that he threw them into disorder and routed them, and the Eretrian cavalry fleeing in consequence, the Chalcidians won a splendid victory." End quote. The annals of all nations contain similar records, though probably among none has the ideal of this love been quite so enthusiastic and heroic as among the post-Homeric Greeks. It is well known that among the Polynesian islanders, for the most part a very gentle and affectionate people, probably inheriting the traditions of a higher culture than they now possess, the most romantic male friendships are, or were, in vogue. Says Herman Melville in Omoo, Chapter 39, quote, "The really curious way in which all Polynesians are in the habit of making bosom friends is deserving of remark. In the annals of the island, Tahiti, are examples of extravagant friendships, unsurpassed by the story of Damon and Pythias. In truth, much more wonderful, for notwithstanding the devotion, even of life in some cases, to which they led, they were frequently entertained at first sight for some stranger from another island." End quote. So thoroughly recognized indeed were these unions that Melville explains in Typee, Chapter 18, that if two men of hostile tribes or islands become thus pledged to each other, then each could pass through the enemy's territory without fear of molestation or injury. And the passionate nature of these attachments is indicated by the following passage from Omoo, another book of Melville's. Quote, "Though little inclined to jealousy in ordinary love matters, the Tahitian will hear of no rivals in his friendship." End quote. Even among savage races lower down than these in the scale of evolution, and who are generally accused of being governed in their love relations only by the most animal desires, we find a genuine sentiment of comradeship beginning to assert itself, as among the Balanda and other African tribes, where regular ceremonies of the betrothal of comrades take place, by the transfusion of a few drops of blood into each other's drinking bowls, by the exchange of names, and the mutual gift of their most precious possessions. But unfortunately, owing to the obtuseness of certain European opinion on this subject, these and other customs have been but little investigated, and have by no means received the attention that they ought. When we turn to the poetic and literary utterances of the more civilized nations on this subject, we cannot be but struck by the range and intensity of the emotions expressed. From the beautiful threnody of David over his friend, whose love was passing the love of women, through the vast panorama of the Homeric Iliad, of which the heroic friendship of Achilles and his dear Patroclus forms really the basic theme, down to the works of the great Greek age, the splendid odes of Pindar burning with clear fire of passion, the lofty elegies of Theognis, full of wise precepts to his beloved Cernus, the sweet pastorals of Theocritus, the passionate lyrics of Sappho, or the more sensual raptures of Anacreon, some of the dramas of Aeschylus and Sophocles, as the Myrmidons of the former and the lover of Achilles of the latter appear to have had this subject for their motive, and many of the prose poem dialogues of Plato were certainly inspired by it. Then coming to the literature of the Roman age, whose materialistic spirit could only with difficulty seize the finer inspirations of the homogenic love, and which, in such writers as Catullus and Martial, could only for the most part give their expression to its grosser side, we still find in Virgil a noble and notable instance. His second eclogue bears the mark of a genuine passion, and according to some, he there, under the name of Alexis, immortalizes his own love for the youthful Alexander. Nor is it possible to pass over in this connection the great mass of Persian literature, and the poets Sa'di, Hafiz, and Jami, and many others, whose names and works are for all time, and whose marvelous love songs, quote, bitter and sweet as the parting kiss on the lips of a friend, end quote, are to a large extent, if not mostly, addressed to those of their own sex. Of the medieval period in Europe, we have, of course, but few literary monuments. Toward its close, we come upon the interesting story of Amis and Emile, 13th century, unearthed by Mr. W. Pater from the Bibliotheca Elzeviriana. Though there is historic evidence of the prevalence of the passion, we may say of this period that its ideal was undoubtedly rather the chivalric love than the love of comrades. But with the Renaissance in Italy and the Elizabethan period in England, the latter once more comes to evidence in a burst of poetic utterances, which culminates perhaps in the magnificent sonnets of Michelangelo and of Shakespeare. Of Michelangelo, whose pure beauty of expression lifts the enthusiasm into the highest regions, as the direct perception of the divine in human form. Footnote: I may be excused for quoting here the sonnet number 54, from J.A. Symonds' translation of the sonnets of Michelangelo. Quote, From thy fair face I learn, O loved Lord, that which no mortal tongue can rightly say. The soul imprisoned in her house of clay, holpen by thee to God hath often soared, and though the vulgar, vain, malignant horde attribute what their grosser wills obey, yet shall this fervent homage that I pay, this love, this faith, pure joys for us afford. Lo, all the lovely things we find on earth resemble for the soul that rightly sees that source of bliss divine which gave us birth, nor have we first fruits or remembrances of heaven elsewhere. Thus, loving loyally, I rise to God, and make death sweet by thee. End quote. The labors of von Scheffler, followed by J.A. Symonds, have now pretty conclusively established the pious frauds of the nephew, and the fact that the love poems of the elder Michelangelo were, for the most part, written to male friends. End footnote. And of Shakespeare, whose passionate words and amorous spirituality of friendship have for long enough been a perplexity to hide-bound commentators. Thence through minor writers, not overlooking Winckelmann in Germany, we pass to quite modern times, in which, notwithstanding the fact that the passion has been misunderstood and misinterpreted, two names stand conspicuously forth. Those of Tennyson, whose In Memoriam is perhaps his finest work, and of Walt Whitman, the enthusiasm of whose poems on comradeship is only paralleled by the devotedness of his labors for his wounded brothers in the American Civil War. It will be noticed that here we have some of the very greatest names in all literature concerned, and that their utterances on this subject equal, if not surpass, in beauty, intensity, and humanity of sentiment whatever has been written in praise of the more ordinarily recognized love. And when we turn to the records of art and compare the way in which man's sense of love and beauty has expressed itself in the portrayal of the male form and the female form respectively, we find exactly the same thing. The whole vista of Greek statuary shows the male passion of beauty in high degree. Yet though the statues of men and youths, by men sculptors, preponderate probably considerably, both in actual number and in devotedness of execution, over the statues of female figures it is, as J.A. Symonds says in his Life of Michelangelo, remarkable that in all the range of the former there are hardly 2 or 3 that show a base or licentious expression, such as is not so very uncommon in the female statues. Knowing as we do the strength of the male physical passion in the life of the Greeks, this one fact speaks strongly for the sense of proportion which must have characterized this passion, at any rate in the most productive age of their art. In the case of Michelangelo, we have an artist who, with brush and chisel, portrayed literally thousands of human forms, but with this peculiarity, that while scores and scores of his male figures are obviously suffused and inspired by a romantic sentiment, there is hardly one of his female figures that is so, the latter being mostly representative of women in her part as mother, or sufferer, or prophetess, or poetess, or in old age, or in any aspect of strength or tenderness, except that which associates itself especially with romantic love. Yet the cleanliness and dignity of Michelangelo's male figures are incontestable, and bear striking witness to the nobility of the sentiment in him, which we have already seen illustrated in his sonnets. This brief sketch may suffice to give the reader some idea of the place and position in the world of the particular sentiment which we are discussing, nor can it fail to impress him if any reference is made to the authorities quoted. With a sense of the dignity and solidity of the sentiment, at any rate as handled by some of the world's greatest men. At the same time, it would be affectation to ignore the fact that, side by side with this view of the subject, there has been another current of opinion leading people, especially in quite modern times in Europe, to look upon attachments of this kind in question with much suspicion and disfavor, and it may be necessary here to say a few words on this latter view. The origin of it is not far to seek. Those who have no great gift themselves of this kind of friendship, who are not in the inner circle of it, so to speak, and do not understand or appreciate its deep emotional and romantic character, have nevertheless heard of certain corruptions and excesses, for these latter leap to publicity. They have heard of the debaucheries of a Nero or a Tiberius. They have noted the scandals of the police courts. They have had some experience, perhaps, of abuses, which may be found in public schools or barracks, and they not unnaturally infer that these things, these excesses and sensualities, are the motive of comrade attachments, and the object for which they exist. Nor do they easily recognize any more profound and intimate bond. To such people, physical intimacies of any kind, at any rate between males, seem inexcusable. There is no distinction in their minds between the simplest or most naive expression of feeling and the gravest abuse of human rights and decency. There is no distinction between a genuine heart attachment and a mere carnal curiosity. They see certain evils that occur or have occurred, and they think, perfectly candidly, that any measures are justifiable to prevent such things recurring. But they do not see the interior love feeling which, when it exists, does legitimately demand some expression. Such folk, in fact, not having the key in themselves to the real situation, hastily assume that the homogenic attachment has no other motive than, or is simply a veil and a cover for, sensuality, and suspect or condemn it accordingly. Thus arises the curious discrepancy of people's views on this important subject, a discrepancy depending on the side from which they approach it. On the one hand, we have anathemas and execrations. On the other, we have the lofty enthusiasm of a man like Plato, one of the leaders of the world's thought for all time, who puts, for example, in the mouth of Phaedrus in the Symposium, such a passage as this, quote, "I know not any greater blessing to a young man beginning life than a virtuous lover, or to the lover than a beloved youth. For the principle which ought to be the guide of men who would nobly live, that principle, I say, neither kindred, nor honor, nor wealth, nor any other motive, is able to implant so well as love. Of what am I speaking? Of the sense of honor and dishonor, without which neither states nor individuals ever do any good or great work. For what lover would not choose rather to be seen of all mankind than by his beloved, either when abandoning his post or throwing away his arms? He would be ready to die 1,000 deaths rather than endure this. Or who would desert his beloved or fail him in the hour of danger? The veriest coward would become an inspired hero, equal to the bravest at such a time. Love would inspire him. That courage which, as Homer says, the god breathes into the soul of heroes, love of his own nature inspires into the lover." End quote. Or again, in the Phaedrus, Plato makes Socrates say, quote, "In like manner the followers of Apollo and of every other god, walking in the ways of their god, seek a love who is to be like their god, and when they have found him, they themselves imitate their god, and persuade their love to do the same, and bring him into harmony with the forms and ways of the god as far as they can. For they have no feelings of envy or jealousy towards their beloved, but they do their utmost to create in him the greatest likeness of themselves and the God whom they honor. Thus fair and blissful to the beloved when he is taken is the desire of the inspired lover, and the initiation of which I speak into the mysteries of true love, if their purpose is effected." End quote. With these few preliminary remarks, we may pass on to consider some recent scientific investigations of the matter in hand. In late times, that is, during the last 30 years or so, a group of scientific and capable men, chiefly in Germany, France, and Italy, have made a special and more or less impartial study of it. Among these may be mentioned Dr. Albert Moll of Berlin, R. von Krafft-Ebing, one of the leading medical authorities of Vienna, whose book on sexual psychopathy has passed into its 10th edition, Dr. Paul Moreau, des séparation du genre génétique. Cesar Lombrosa, the author of various works on anthropology, M.A. Rafalovich, Uranianism et unisexuality, Auguste Forel, De sexuale frage, Montagaza, K.H. Ulrichs, and last but not least, Dr. Havelock Ellis, of whose great work on the psychology of sex, the second volume, is dedicated to the subject of sexual inversion. Footnote: one ought also to mention some later writers, like Dr. Magnus Hirschfeld and Dr. von Romer, whose work, though avowedly favorable to the Urning movement, is in a high degree scientific and reliable in character. End footnote. The result of these investigations has been that a very altered complexion has been given to the subject. For whereas at first it was merely assumed that the phenomena were of morbid character, and that the leaning of the love sentiment toward one of the same sex was always associated with degeneracy or disease, it is very noticeable that step by step, with the accumulation of reliable information, this assumption has been abandoned. The point of view has changed, and the change has been most marked in the latest writers, such as A. Moll and Havelock Ellis. It is not possible here to go into anything like a detailed account of the works of these various authors, their theories, and the immense number of interesting cases and observations which they have contributed. But some of the general conclusions which flow from their researches may be pointed out. In the first place, their labors have established the fact, known hitherto only to individuals, that sexual inversion, that is, the leaning of desire to one of the same sex, is in a vast number of cases quite instinctive and congenital, mentally and physically, and therefore twined in the very roots of individual life and practically ineradicable. To men and women thus affected with an innate homosexual bias, Ulrichs gave the name Urning, since pretty widely accepted by scientists. Some details with regard to Urnings I have given in the preceding paper, but it should be said here that too much emphasis cannot be laid on the distinction between these born lovers of their own kind and that class of persons with whom they are so often confused, who out of mere carnal curiosity or extravagance of desire, or from the dearth of opportunities for a more normal satisfaction, as in school, barracks, etc., adopt some homosexual practices. It is the latter class who become chiefly prominent in the public eye, and who excite, naturally enough, public reprobation. In their case, the attraction is felt by themselves and all concerned to be merely sensual and morbid. In the case of others, however, the feeling is, as said, so deeply rooted and twined with the mental and emotional life that the person concerned has difficulty in imagining themselves affected otherwise than he is, and to him at least his love appears healthy and natural, and indeed a necessary part of his individuality. In the second place, it has become clear that the number of individuals affected with sexual inversion in some way or other is very great, much greater than is generally supposed to be the case. It is, however, very difficult, or perhaps impossible, to arrive at a satisfactory figure on the subject, for the simple reason that the proportions vary so greatly among different peoples, and even in different sections of society and in different localities, And because, of course, there are all possible grades of sexual inversion to deal with, from that in which the instinct is quite exclusively directed toward the same sex, to the other extreme in which it is normally towards the opposite sex, but capable, occasionally and under exceptional attractions, of inversion towards its own. This last condition being probably among some peoples very widespread, if not universal. In the third place, by the tabulations and comparisons of a great number of cases and confessions, it has become pretty well established that the individuals affected with inversion in marked degree do not, after all, differ from the rest of mankind or womankind in any physical or mental particular which can be distinctly indicated. Footnote: though there is no doubt a general tendency toward femininity of type in the male learning and towards masculinity in the female. End footnote. No congenital association with any particular physical conformation or malformation has yet been discovered, nor with any distinct disease of body or mind, nor does it appear that persons of this class are usually of gross or specially low type, but if anything, rather the opposite, being mostly of refined, sensitive nature, and including, as Krafft-Ebing points out, Psychopathia Sexualis, 7th edition, page 227. A great number, quote, highly gifted in the fine arts, especially music and poetry, end quote. And as Mantegazza says, many persons of high literary and social distinction. It is true that Krafft-Ebing insists on the generally strong sexual equipment of this class of persons among men, but he hastens to say that their emotional love is also, quote, enthusiastic and exalted, and that, while bodily congress is desired, the sexual act with which they are vulgarly credited is in most cases repugnant to them. The only distinct characteristic which the scientific writers claim to have established is a marked tendency to nervous development in the subject, not infrequently associated with nervous maladies. But, as I shall presently have occasion to show, there is reason to think that the validity even of this characteristic has been exaggerated. Taking the general case of men with a marked exclusive preference for persons of their own sex, Krafft-Ebing says, P.S., page 256, quote, the sexual life of these homosexuals is mutatis mutandis, just the same as in the case of normal sex love. The Urning loves, deifies his male beloved one, exactly as the woman-wooing man does his beloved. For him, he is capable of the greatest sacrifice, experiences the torments of unhappy, often unrequited love, of faithlessness on his beloved's part, of jealousy, and so forth. His attention is enchained only by the male form. The sight of feminine charms is indifferent to him, if not repugnant. End quote. Then he goes on to say that many such men, notwithstanding their actual aversion to intercourse with the female, do ultimately marry, either from ethical, as sometimes happens, or from social considerations. But very remarkable, as illustrating the depth and tenacity of the homogenic instinct, and pathetic too, are the records that he gives of these cases. For in many of them a real friendship and regard between the married pair was still of no avail to overcome the distaste on the part of one to sexual intercourse with the other, or to prevent the experience of actual physical distress after such intercourse, or to check the continual flow of affection of some third person of the same sex. And thus unwillingly, so to speak, this bias remained a cause of suffering to the end. I have said that, at the outset, it was assumed that the homogenic emotion was morbid in itself, and probably always associated with distinct disease, either physical or mental, but that the progress of the inquiry has served more and more to dissipate this view, and that it is noticeable that the latest of the purely scientific authorities are the least disposed to insist upon the theory of morbidity. It is true that Krafft-Ebing clings to the opinion that there is generally some neuroses or degeneration of a nerve center or inherited tendency in that direction, associated with the instinct. See page 190, 7th edition, also 227, where he speaks rather vaguely of, quote, an hereditary neuropathic or psychopathic tendency, end quote. Neuropsychopastiche, Belastung. But it is an obvious criticism on this that there are few people in modern life, perhaps none, who could be pronounced absolutely free from such a Belastung. And whether the Dorian Greeks or the Polynesian islanders or the Albanian mountaineers or any of the notably hardy races among whom this affection has been developed were particularly troubled by nervous degeneration, we may well doubt. As to Moll, though he speaks of the instinct as morbid, feeling perhaps in duty bound to do so, it is very noticeable that he abandons the ground of its association with other morbid symptoms, as this association, he says, is by no means always to be observed, and is fain to rest his judgment on the dictum that the mere failure of the sexual instinct to propagate the species is itself pathological, a dictum which in turn obviously springs from that prejudgment of scientists, that generation is the sole object of love, and which, if pressed, would involve the good doctor in awkward dilemmas, as, for instance, that every worker bee is a pathological specimen. Finally, we find that Havelock Ellis, one of the latest writers of weight on this subject, in Chapter 6 of his Sexual Inversion, combats the idea that this temperament is necessarily morbid, and suggests that the tendency should rather be called an anomaly than a disease. He says, 2nd edition, page 186, quote, thus in sexual inversion we have what may be fairly called a sport or variation, one of those organic aberrations which we see throughout living nature in plants and in animals, end quote. With regard to the nerve degeneration theory, while it may be allowed that the sexual inversion is not uncommonly found in connection with the specially nervous temperament, it must be remembered that its occasional association with nervous troubles or disease is quite another matter, since such troubles ought perhaps to be looked upon as the results rather than the causes of the inversion. It is difficult, of course, for outsiders not personally experienced in the matter to realize the great strain and tension of nerves under which those persons grow up from boyhood to manhood, or from girl to womanhood, who find their deepest and strongest instincts under the ban of the society around them, who, before they clearly understand the drift of their own natures, discover that they are somehow cut off from the sympathy and understanding of those nearest to them, and who know they can never give expression to their tenderest yearnings of affection without exposing themselves to the possible charge of actions stigmatized as odious crimes. that such a strain, acting on one who is perhaps already of a nervous temperament, should tend to cause nervous prostration or even mental disturbance is of course obvious. And if such disturbances are really found to be commoner among homogenic lovers than among ordinary folk, we have in these social causes probably a sufficient explanation of the fact. Then again, in this connection, it must never be forgotten that the medico-scientific inquirer is bound on the whole to meet with those cases that are of a morbid character, rather than with those that are healthy in their manifestation, since indeed it is the former that he lays himself out for. And since the field of his research is usually a great modern city, there is little wonder if disease colors his conclusions. In the case of Dr. Moll, who carried out his researches largely under the guidance of the Berlin police, whose acquaintance with the subject would naturally be limited to its least satisfactory sides, the only marvel is that his verdict is so markedly favorable as it is. As Krafft-Ebing says in his own preface, quote, "It is the sad privilege of medicine, and especially of psychiatry, to look always on the reverse side of life, on the weakness and wretchedness of man." End quote. Having regard, then, to the direction in which science has been steadily moving in this matter, it is not difficult to see that the epithet morbid will probably before long be abandoned as descriptive of the homogenic bias. That is, of the general sentiment of love toward a person of the same sex. That there are excesses of the passion, cases, as in ordinary sex love, where mere physical desire becomes a mania, we may freely admit. But as it would be unfair to judge the purity of marriage by the evidence of the divorce courts, so it would be monstrous to measure the truth and beauty of the attachment in question by those instances which stand most prominently perhaps in the eye of the modern public. And after all deductions, there remains, we contend, the vast body of cases in which the manifestation of the instinct has, on the whole, the character of normality and healthfulness. Sufficiently so, in fact, to constitute this a distinct variety of sexual passion. The question, of course, not being whether the instinct is capable of morbid and exaggerated manifestation, for that can easily be proved of any instinct, but whether it is capable of a healthy and sane expression. And this, we think, it has abundantly shown itself to be. Anyhow, the work that science has practically done has been to destroy the dogmatic attitude of the former current opinion, from which itself started, and to leave the whole subject freed from a great deal of misunderstanding, and much more open than before. If on the one hand its results have been chiefly of a negative character, and it admits that it does not understand the exact place and foundation of this attachment, on the other hand, since it recognizes the deeply beneficial influences of an intimate love relation of the usual kind on those concerned, it also allows that there are some persons for whom these necessary reactions can only come from one of the same sex as themselves. Successful love, says Moll, page 125, quote, exercises a helpful influence on the yearning. His mental and bodily condition improves, and capacity of work increases, just as it happens in the case of a normal youth with his love. End quote. And further on, page 173, In a letter from a man of this kind occur these words, quote, "The passion is, I suppose, so powerful, just because one looks for everything in the loved man. Love, friendship, ideal, and sense satisfaction. As it is at present, I suffer the agonies of a deep unresponded passion, which wake me like a nightmare from sleep, and I am conscious of physical pain in the region of the heart." End quote. In such cases, the love, in some degree physically expressed, of another person of the same sex is allowed to be as much a necessity and a condition of healthy life and activity as in more ordinary cases is the love of a person of the opposite sex. If then the physical element, which is sometimes present in the love of which we are speaking, is a difficulty and a stumbling block, it must be allowed that it is a difficulty that nature confronts us with, and which cannot be disposed of by mere anathema and execration. The only theory which has at all held its ground in this matter is that in congenital cases of sex inversion there is a mixture of male and female elements in the same person, so that, for instance, in the same embryo, the emotional and nervous regions may develop along feminine lines, while the outer body and functions may determine themselves as distinctly masculine, or vice versa. Such cross-development may take place, obviously, in a great variety of ways, and thus possibly explain the remarkable varieties of the Uranian temperament. But in all such cases, strange as may be the problems thus arising, these problems are of nature's own producing, and can hardly be laid to the door of the individual who has literally to bear their cross. For such individuals, expressions of feeling become natural, which to others seem out of place and uncalled for, and not only natural, but needful and inevitable. To deny such people all expression of their emotion is probably in the end to cause it to burst forth with the greater violence. And it may be suggested that our British code of manners, by forbidding the lighter marks of affection between youths and men, acts just contrary to its own purpose, and drives intimacies down into less open and unexceptionable channels. With regard to this physical element, it must also be remembered that since the homogenic love, whether between man or between woman and woman, can from the nature of the case never find expression on the physical side so freely and completely as is the case with the ordinary love, it must tend rather more than the latter to run along emotional channels, and to find its vent in sympathies of social life and companionship. If one studies carefully the expression of the Greek statues, see page 9, and the lessons of the Greek literature, one sees clearly that the ideal of Greek life was a very continent one. The trained male, the athlete, the man temperate and restrained, even chaste, for the sake of bettering his powers. It was round this conception that the Greeks kindled their finer emotions, and so of their love. A base and licentious indulgence was not in line with it. They may not have always kept to their ideal, but there it was. And I am inclined to think that the homogenic instinct, for the reasons given above, would, in the long run, tend to work itself out in this direction. And consonant with this is the fact that this passion in the past, as pointed out by J. Addington Symonds in his paper on Dante-esque and Platonic ideals of love, has, as a matter of fact, inspired such a vast amount of heroism and romance, only paralleled indeed by the loves of chivalry which of course, owing to their special character, were subject to a similar transmutation. In all these matters, the public opinion has probably been influenced by the arbitrary notion that the function of love is limited to child breeding, and that any love not concerned in the propagation of the race must necessarily be of a dubious character. And in enforcing this view, no doubt the Hebraic and Christian tradition has exercised a powerful influence, dating as it almost certainly does from far back times, when the multiplication of the tribe was one of the first duties of its members and one of the first necessities of corporate life. But nowadays, when the need has swung round all the other way, it is not unreasonable to suppose that a similar revolution will take place in people's views of the place and purpose of the non-child-bearing love. I have now said enough, I think, to show that, though much in relation to the homogenic attachment is obscure, and though it may have its special pitfalls and temptations, making it quite necessary to guard against a too great latitude on the physical side, yet on its ethical and social sides it is pregnant with meaning and has received at various times in history abundant justification. It necessary does not seem impossible to suppose that, as the ordinary love has a special function in the propagation of the race, so the other has its special function in social and heroic work, and in the generation, not of bodily children, but of those children of the mind, the philosophical conceptions and ideals which transform our lives and those of society. J. Addington Symonds, in his privately printed pamphlet, A Problem in Greek Ethics, now published in a German translation, endeavors to reconstruct, as it were, the genesis of comrade love among the Dorians in early Greek times. Thus, quote, "Without sufficiency of women, without the sanctities of established domestic life, inspired by the memories of Achilles, and venerating their ancestor Heracles, the Dorian warriors had special opportunity for elevating comradeship to the rank of an enthusiasm. The incidents of immigration into a foreign country, perils of the sea, passages of rivers and mountains, assaults of fortresses and cities, landings on a hostile shore, night vigils by the side of blazing beacons, foragings for food, picket services in the front of watchful foes, involved adventures capable of shedding the luster of romance on friendship. These circumstances, by bringing the virtues of sympathy with the weak, tenderness for the beautiful, protection for the young, together with corresponding qualities of gratitude, self-devotion, admiring attachment into play, may have tended to cement unions between man and man no less firm than that of marriage. On such connections, a wise captain would have relied for giving strength to his battalions, and for keeping alive the flames of enterprise and daring." End quote. The author then goes on to suggest that, though in such relations as those indicated, the physical probably had some share, yet it did not at that time overbalance the emotional and physical elements, or lead to the corruption and effeminacy of a later age. At Sparta, the lover was called Espnelos, the inspirer, and the younger beloved Aetes, the hearer. This alone would show the partly educational aspects in which comradeship was conceived, and 100 passages from classic literature might be quoted to prove how deeply it had entered into the Greek mind that this love was the cradle of social chivalry and heroic life. Finally, it seems to have been Plato's favorite doctrine that the relation, if properly conducted, led up to the disclosure of true philosophy in the mind, to the divine vision or mania, and to the remembrance or rekindling within the soul of all the forms of celestial beauty. He speaks of this kind of love as causing a, quote, generation in the beautiful, end quote, within the souls of the lovers. The image of the beloved one passing into the mind of the lover, and upward through its deepest recesses, reaches and unites itself to the essential forms of divine beauty there long hidden. The originals, as it were, of all creation, and stirring them to life excites a kind of generative descent of noble thoughts and impulses, which henceforward modify the whole cast of thought and life of the one so affected. If there is any truth, even only a grain or two, in these speculations, it is easy to see that the love with which we are specially dealing is a very important factor in society, and that its neglect or its repression or its vulgar misapprehension may be matters of considerable damage or danger to the common weal. It is easy to see that while on the one hand marriage is of indispensable importance to the state as providing the workshop, as it were, for the breeding and rearing of children, another form of union is almost equally indispensable to supply the basis for social activities of other kinds. Everyone is conscious that without a close affectional tie of some kind, his life is not complete, his powers are crippled, and his energies are inadequately spent. Yet it is not to be expected, though it may of course happen, that the man and woman who have dedicated themselves to each other and to family life should leave the care of their children and the work they have to do at home in order to perform social duties of a remote and less obvious, though maybe more arduous, character. Nor is it to be expected that a man or woman single-handed, without the counsel of a helpmate in the hour of difficulty, or his or her love in the hour of need, should feel equal in these wider activities. If, to refer once more to the classic story, the love of Harmodius had been for a wife and children at home, he would probably not have cared, and it would hardly have been his business to slay the tyrant. And unless, on the other hand, each of the friends had had the love of his comrade to support him, the two could hardly have nerved themselves to this kind of audacious and even memorable exploit. So it is difficult to believe that anything can supply the force and liberate the energies required for social and mental activities of the most necessary kind so well as a comrade union, which yet leaves the two lovers free from the responsibilities and impediments of family life. For if the slaughter of tyrants is not the chief social duty nowadays, we have with us hydra-headed monsters at least as numerous as the tyrants of old, and more difficult to deal with, and requiring no little courage to encounter. And beyond the extirpation of evils, we have solid work waiting to be done in the patient and lifelong building up of new forms of society, new orders of thought, and new institutions of human solidarity, all of which in their genesis must meet with opposition, ridicule, hatred, and even violence. Such campaigns as these, though different in kind from those of the Dorian mountaineers described above, will call for equal hardihood and courage, and will stand in need of a comradeship as true and valiant. And it may indeed be doubted whether the higher heroic and spiritual life of a nation is ever quite possible without the sanction of this attachment in its institutions, adding a new range and scope to the possibilities of love. Walt Whitman, the inaugurator, it may almost be said, of a new world of democratic ideals in literature, and, as one of the best of our critics has remarked, the most Greek in spirit and in performance of modern writers, insists continually of this social function of, quote, intense and loving comradeship, the personal and passionate attachment of man to man. I will make, he says, the most splendid race the sun ever shone upon. I will make divine magnetic lands. I will make inseparable cities with their arms about each other's necks by the love of comrades. And again, in Democratic Vistas, quote, it is to the development, identification, and general prevalence of that fervid comradeship, the adhesive love at least rivaling the amative love hitherto possessing imaginative literature, if not going beyond it, that I look for the counterbalance and offset of materialistic and vulgar American democracy, and for the spiritualization thereof. I say democracy infers such loving comradeship as its most inevitable twin or counterpart, without which it will be incomplete, in vain, and incapable of perpetuating itself. End quote. Yet Whitman could not have spoken as he did with a kind of authority on this subject if he had not been fully aware that, through the masses of the people, this attachment was already alive and working, though doubtless in a somewhat suppressed and unself-conscious form. And if he had not ample knowledge of its effects and influences in himself and others around him, like all great artists, he could but give form and light to that which already existed, dim and intuit, in the heart of the people. To those who have dived at all below the surface in this direction, it will be familiar enough that the homogenic passion ramifies widely through all modern society, and that among the masses of the people, as among the classes, even below the stolid surface and reserve of British manners, letters pass and enduring attachments are formed, differing in no very obvious respect from those correspondences which persons of opposite sex knit with each other under similar circumstances, and that hitherto, while this relation has occasionally, in its grosser forms and abuses, come into public notice through the police reports, etc., its more sane and spiritual manifestations, though really a moving force in the body politic, have remained unrecognized. It is hardly needful in these days when social questions loom so large upon us to emphasize the importance of a bond which, by the most passionate and lasting compulsion, may draw members of the different classes together, none the less strongly because they are members of different classes. A moment's consideration must convince us that such comradeship may, as Whitman says, have, quote, deepest relations to general politics, end quote. It is noticeable, too, in its deepest relations to politics, that the movement among women towards their own liberation and emancipation, which is taking place all over the civilized world, has been accompanied by a marked development of the homogenic passion among the female sex. It may be said that a certain strain in the relations between the opposite sexes, which has come about owing to a growing consciousness among women that they have been oppressed and unfairly treated by men, and a growing unwillingness to ally themselves unequally in marriage, that this strain has caused the womankind to draw more closely together and to cement alliances of their own. But whatever the cause may be, it is pretty certain that such comrade alliances, and of quite devoted kind, are becoming increasingly common, and especially perhaps among the more cultured classes of women, who are working out the great cause of their sex's liberation. Nor is it difficult to see the importance of such alliances in such a campaign. In the United States, where the battle of women's independence is also being fought, the tendency mentioned is as strongly marked. A few words may here be said about the legal aspect of this important question. It is to be remarked that the present state of the law, both in Germany and Britain, arising as it does partly out of some of the misapprehension above alluded to, and partly out of the sheer unwillingness of legislatures to discuss the question, is really impractical. While the law rightly seeks to prevent acts of violence and public scandal, it may be argued that it is going beyond its province when it attempts to regulate the private and voluntary relations of adult persons to each other. The homogenic affection is a valuable social force, and in some cases a necessary element of noble human character, yet the Act of 1885 makes almost any familiarity in such cases the possible basis of a criminal charge. The law has no doubt had substantial ground for previous statutes on the subject, dealing with a certain gross act, but in so severely condemning the least familiarity between male persons, we think it has gone too far. It has undertaken a censorship over private morals, entirely apart from social results, which is beyond its province, and which, even if it were its province, it could not possibly fulfill. It has opened wider than ever before the door to a real, most serious social evil and crime, that of blackmailing, and it has thrown a shadow over even the simplest and most ordinary expressions of an attachment which may, as we have seen, be of great value in the national life. That the homosexual feeling, like the heterosexual, may lead to public abuses of liberty and decency, that it needs a strict self-control, and that much teaching and instruction on the subject is needed, we of course do not deny. But as in the case of persons of opposite sex, the law limits itself on the whole to a maintenance of public order, the protection of the weak from violence and insult, and of the young from their inexperience. So we think it should be here. The much-needed teaching and the true morality on the subject must be given, as it can only be given by the spread of proper education and ideas, and not by the clumsy bludgeon of the statute book. Having thus shown the importance of the homogenic or comrade attachment in some form in national life, it would seem high time now that the modern peoples should recognize this in their institutions, and endeavor, at least in their public opinion and systems of education, to understand this factor and give it its proper place. The undoubted evils which exist in relation to it, for instance in our public schools, as well as in our public life, owe their existence largely to the fact that the whole subject is left in the gutter, so to speak, in darkness and concealment. No one offers a clue of better things, nor to point a way out of the wilderness. And by this very non-recognition, the passion is perverted into its least satisfactory channels. All love, one would say, must have its responsibilities, else it is liable to degenerate and to dissipate itself in mere sentiment or sensuality. The normal marriage between man and woman leads up to the foundation of the household and the family. The love between parents and children implies duties and cares on both sides. The homogenic attachment, left unrecognized, easily loses some of its best quality and becomes an ephemeral and corrupt thing. Yet, as we have seen, and as I am pointing out in the following chapter, it may, when occurring between an elder and younger, prove to be an immense educational force, while, as between equals, it may be turned to social and heroic uses, such as hardly can be demanded or expected from the ordinary marriage. It would seem high time, I say, that public opinion should recognize these facts, and so give to this attachment the sanction and dignity which arise from public recognition, as well as the definite form and outline which flow from the existence of an accepted ideal or standard in the matter. It is often said how necessary for the morality of the ordinary marriage is some public recognition of the relation, and some accepted standard of conduct in it. May not, to a lesser degree, something of the same kind, as suggested in the next chapter, be true of the homogenic attachment? It has had its place as a recognized and guarded institution in the elder and more primitive societies, and it seems probable that a similar place will be accorded to it in the societies of the future. End of Chapter 3. Chapter 4 of the Intermediate Sex, a study of some transitional types of men and women. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit librivox.org. Recording by Chuck Williamson. The Intermediate Sex, a study of some transitional types of men and women. By Edward Carpenter. Chapter 4. Affection in Education. The place of affection and the need of it as an educative force in school life is a subject which is beginning to attract a good deal of attention. Hitherto, education has been centered on intellectual and physical development, but the affections have been left to take care of themselves. Now it is beginning to be seen that the affections have an immense deal to say in the building up of the brain and the body. Their evolution and organization in some degree is probably going to become an important part of school management. School friendships, of course, exist, and almost everyone remembers that they filled a large place in the outlook of his early years. But he remembers, too, that they were not recognized in any way, and that in consequence, the main part of their force and value was wasted. Yet it is evident that the first unfolding of a strong attachment in boyhood or girlhood must have a profound influence. Well, if it occurs between an elder and a younger schoolmate, or as sometimes happens, between the young thing and its teacher, its importance in the educational sense can hardly be overrated. That such feelings sometimes take quite intense and romantic forms, few will deny. I have before me a letter in which the author, speaking of an attachment he experienced when a boy of 16 for a youth somewhat older than himself, says, quote, "I would have died for him 10 times over. My devices and plannings to meet him, to come across him casually, as it were those of a lad for his sweetheart. And when I saw him, my heart beat so violently that it caught my breath, and I could not speak. We met in Redacted, and for the weeks that he stayed there, I thought of nothing else. Thought of him night and day, and when he returned to London, I used to write him weekly letters, veritable love letters of many sheets in length. Yet I never felt one particle of jealousy, though our friendship lasted for some years. The passion, violent and extravagant as it was, I believe to have been perfectly free from sex feeling and perfectly wholesome and good for me. It distinctly contributed to my growth. Looking back upon it and analyzing it as well as I can, I seem to see the chief element in it, an escape from the extremely narrow Puritanism in which I was reared, into a large, sunny, ingenious nature which knew nothing at all of the bondage of which I was beginning to be acutely conscious." End quote. Shelley, in his fragmentary essay on friendship, speaks in the most glowing terms of an attachment he formed at school, and so does Leigh Hunt in his autobiography. Says the latter, quote, "If I had reaped no other benefit from Christ Hospital, the school would be ever dear to me from the recollection of the friendships I formed in it, and of the first heavenly taste it gave me of that most spiritual of the affections. I shall never forget the impression it made on me. I loved my friend for his gentleness, his candor, his truth, his good repute, his freedom, even from my own livelier manner, his calm and reasonable kindness. I doubt whether he ever had a conception of a tithe of the regard and respect I entertained for him, and I smile to think of the perplexity, though he never showed it, which he probably felt sometime at my enthusiastic expressions, for I thought him a kind of angel." End quote. It is not necessary, however, to quote authorities on such a subject as this. Anyone who has had experience of schoolboys knows well enough that they are capable of forming these romantic and devoted attachments, and that their alliances are often of the kind especially referred to as having a bearing on education, i.e., between an elder and a younger. They are genuine attractions, free as a rule, and at their inception from secondary motives. They are not formed by the elder one for any personal ends. More often, indeed, I think they are begun by the younger, who naively allows his admiration of the elder one to become visible. But they are absorbing and intense, and on either side their influence is deeply felt and long remembered. That such attachments may be of the very greatest value is self-evident. The younger boy looks on the other as a hero, loves to be with him, thrills with pleasure at his words of praise or kindness, imitates and makes his pattern and standard, learns exercises and games, contracts habits, or picks up information from him. The elder one, touched, becomes protector and helper. The unselfish side of his nature is drawn out, and he develops a real affection and tenderness towards the younger. He takes all sorts of trouble to intimate his protege in field sports or studies, is proud of the latter's success, and leads him on perhaps later to share his own ideals of life and thought and work. Sometimes the alliance will begin in a corresponding way from the side of the elder boy. Sometimes, as said, between a boy and a master, such an attachment, or the germ of it, is found, and indeed it is difficult to say what gulf or difference of age or culture or class in society is so great that affection of this kind will not, on occasion, overpass it. I have by me a letter which was written by a boy of 11 or 12 to a young man of 24 or 25. The boy was rather a wild, naughty boy, and had given his parents, working-class folk, a good deal of trouble. He attended, however, some sort of night school or evening class, and there conceived the strongest affection, evidenced by this letter, for his teacher, the young man in question, quite spontaneously, and without any attempt on the part of the latter to elicit it, and, which was equally important, without any attempt on his part to deny it. The result was most favorable. The one force which could really reach the boy had, as it were, been found, and he developed rapidly and well. The following extract is from a letter written by an elder man who has had large experience as a teacher. He says, quote, "It has always seemed to me that the rapport that exists between two human beings, whether of the same or of different sex, is a force not sufficiently recognized, and capable of producing great results. Plato fully understood its importance, and aimed at giving what to his countrymen was more or less sensual a noble and exalted direction. As one who has had much to do in instructing boys and starting them in life, I am convinced that the great secret of being a good teacher consists in the possibility of that rapport, not only of a merely intellectual nature, but involving a certain physical element, a personal affection almost indescribable, that grows up between pupil and teacher, and through which thoughts are shared and an influence created that could exist in no other way." End quote. And it must be evident to everyone that to the expanding mind of a small boy, to have a relation of real affection with some sensible and helpful elder of his own sex must be a priceless boon. At that age, love to the other sex has hardly declared itself, and indeed is not exactly what is wanted. The unformed mind requires an ideal of itself, as it were, to which it can cling or towards which it can grow. Yet it is equally evident that the relation and the success of it will depend immensely on the character of the elder one, on the self-restraint and tenderness of which he is capable, and on the ideal of life which he has in his mind. That, possibly, is the reason why Greek custom, at least in the early days of Hellas, not only recognized friendships between elder and younger youths as a national institution of great importance, but laid down very distinct laws or rules concerning the conduct of them, so as to be a guide and a help to the elder in what was acknowledged to be a position of responsibility. In Crete, for instance, the friendship was entered into quite a formal and public way, with the understanding and consent of relatives. The position of the elder was clearly defined, and it became his business to train and exercise the younger in skill of arms, the chase, etc., while the latter could obtain redress at law if the elder subjected him to insult or injury of any kind. At the end of a certain period of probation, if the younger desired it, he could leave his comrade. If not, he became his squire or henchman, the elder being bound to furnish his military equipments. And they fought thenceforward side by side in battle, quote, inspired with double valor, according to the notions of the cretins, by the gods of war and love, end quote. Similar customs prevailed in Sparta, and in a less defined way in other Greek states, as indeed they have prevailed among many semi-barbaric races on the threshold of civilization. When, however, we turn to modern life and the actual situation, and for instance in the public schools of today, it may well be objected that we find very little of the suggested ideal, but rather an appalling descent in the most uninspiring conditions. So far from friendship being an institution whose value is recognized and understood, it is at best scantily acknowledged, and is often actually discountenanced and misunderstood. And though attachments such as we have portrayed exist, they exist underground, as it were, at their peril, and half stifled in an atmosphere which can only be described as that of the gutter. Somehow, the disease of premature sexuality seems to have got possession of our centers of education, and, what is perhaps their worst feature, cloud and degrade the boys' conception of what true love or friendship may be. To those who are familiar with large public schools, the state of affairs does not need describing. A friend, who has placed some notes at my disposal, says that in his time a certain well-known public school was a mass of uncleanliness, incontinence, and dirty conversation, while at the same time a great deal of genuine affection, even to heroism, was shown among the boys in their relations with one another. But, quote, all these things were treated by masters and boys alike as more or less unholy, with the result that they were either sought after or flung aside according to the sexual or emotional instinct of the boy. No attempt was made at discrimination. A kiss was by comparison as unclean as the act of fellatio, and no one had any gauge or principle whatever on which to guide the cravings of boyhood. End quote. The writer then goes into details which it is not necessary to reproduce here. He and others were initiated in the mysteries of sex by the dormitory servant, and the boys, thus corrupted, mishandled each other. Naturally, in any such atmosphere as this, the chances against the formation of a decent and healthy attachment are very large. If the elder youth happen to be given to sensuality, he has here his opportunity. If, on the other hand, he is not given to it, the ideas current around probably have the effect of making him suspect his own affection, and he ends by smothering and disowning the best part of his nature. In both ways, harm is done. The big boys in such places become either coarse and licentious, or hard and self-righteous. The small boys, instead of being educated and strengthened by the elder ones, become effeminate little wretches, the favorites, the petted boys, and the spoons of the school. As time goes on, the public opinion of the school ceases to believe in the possibility of a healthy friendship. The masters begin to presume, and not without reason, that all affection means sensual practices, and end by doing their best to discourage it. Now, this state of affairs is really desperate. There is no need to be puritanical, or to look upon the lapses of boyhood as unpardonable sins. Indeed, it may be allowed, as far as that goes, that a little frivolity is better than hardness and self-righteousness. Yet everyone feels, and must feel, who knows anything about the matter, that the state of our schools is bad. And it is so because, after all, purity, in the sense of continence, is of the first importance to boyhood. To prolong the period of continence in a boy's life is to prolong the period of growth. This is a simple physiological law, and a very obvious one. And whatever other things may be said in favor of purity, it remains perhaps the most weighty. To introduce sensual and sexual habits, and one of the worst of these is self-abuse, at an early age, is to arrest growth, both physical and mental. And what is even more, it means to arrest the capacity for affection. I believe affection, attachment, whether to the one sex or the other, springs up normally in the youthful mind in a quite diffuse, ideal, emotional form, a kind of longing and amazement as at something divine, with no definite thought or distinct consciousness of sex in it. The sentiment expands and fills, as it were, like a rising tide, every cranny of the emotional and moral nature, and the longer, of course within reasonable limits, its definite outlet towards sex is deferred, the longer does this period of emotional growth and development continue, and the greater is the refinement and breadth and strength of character resulting. All experience shows that a too early outlet towards sex cheapens and weakens affectional capacity. Yet this early outlet it is which is the great trouble of our public schools, and it really does not seem unlikely that the peculiar character of the middle-class man of today, his undeveloped affectional nature, and something of brutishness and woodenness, is largely due to the prevalent condition of the places of his education. The Greeks, with their wonderful instinct of fitness, seem to have perceived the right path in all this matter, and, while encouraging friendship, as we have seen, made a great point of modesty in early life, the guardians and teachers of every well-born boy being especially called upon to watch over the sobriety of his habits and manners. We have then in education generally, it seems to me, and whether of boys or of girls, two great currents to deal with, which cannot be ignored, and which certainly ought to be candidly recognized and given their right direction. One of these currents is that of friendship. The other is that of the young thing's natural curiosity about sex. The latter is, of course, or should be, a perfectly legitimate interest. A boy at puberty naturally wants to know, and ought to know, what is taking place, and what the uses and functions of his body are. He does not go very deep into things. A small amount of information will probably satisfy him, but the curiosity is there, and it is perfectly certain that the boy, if he is a boy of any sense or character, will in some shape or another get to satisfy it. The process is really a mental one. Desire, except in some abnormal cases, has not manifested itself strongly, and there is often, perhaps generally, an actual repugnance at first to anything like sexual practices. But the wish for information exists, and is, I say, legitimate enough. In almost all human societies, except, curiously, the modern nations, there have been institutions for the initiation of the youth of either sex into these matters, and these initiations have generally been associated, in the opening blossom of the young mind, with inculcation of the ideals of manhood and womanhood, courage, hardihood, and the duties of the citizen or the soldier. But what does the modern school do? It shuts a trap door down on the whole matter. There is a hush, a grim silence. Legitimate curiosity soon becomes illegitimate of its kind, and a furtive desire creeps in, where there was no desire before. The method of the gutter prevails. In the absence of any recognition of schoolboy needs, contraband information is smuggled from one to another. Chaff and smut take the place of sensible and decent explanations. Unhealthy practices follow. The sacredness of sex goes its way, never to return, and the skull is filled with premature and morbid talk and thought about a subject which should, by rights, only just be rising over the mental horizon. The meeting of these two currents of ideal attachment and sexual desire constitutes a rather critical period, even when it takes place in the normal way, i.e., later on, and at the matrimonial age. Under the most favorable conditions, a certain conflict occurs in the mind at their first encounter. But in the modern school, this conflict, precipitated far too soon, and accompanied by an artificial suppression of the nobler current and a premature hastening of the baser one, ends in simple disaster to the former. Masters wage war against incontinence, and are right to do so. But how do they wage it? As said, by grim silence and fury, by driving the abscess deeper, by covering the drain over, and by confusing when it comes before them, both in their own minds and that of the boys, a real attachment with that which they condemn. Not long ago, the headmaster of a large public school, coming suddenly out of his study, chanced upon two boys embracing each other in the corridor. Possibly, and even probably, it was that simple and natural expression of an unsophisticated attachment. Certainly it was nothing that in itself could be said to be either right or wrong. What did he do? He hailed the two boys into his study, gave them a long lecture on the nefariousness of their conduct, with copious hints that he knew what such things meant and what they led to, and ended by punishing both condignly. Could anything be more foolish? If their friendship was clean and natural, the master was only trying to make them feel that it was unclean and unnatural, and that a lovely and honorable thing was disgraceful. If the act was, which at least is improbable, a mere signal of lust, even then the best thing would have been to assume that it was honorable, and by talking to the boys either together or separately to try and inspire them with a better ideal. While if, between these positions, the master really thought the affection, though honorable, would lead to things undesirable, then plainly to punish the two was only to cement their love for each other, to give them a strong reason for concealing it, and to hasten its onward course. Yet everyone knows that this is the kind of way in which the subject is treated in schools. It is the method of despair, and masters, perhaps not unnaturally, finding that they have not the time which would be needed for personal dealing with each boy, nor the forces of their command by which they might hope to introduce new ideals of life and conduct into their little community, and feeling thus utterly unable to cope with the situation, allow themselves to drift into a policy of mere silence with regard to it, tempered by outbreaks of ungoverned and unreasoning severity. I venture to think that schoolmasters will never successfully solve the difficulty until they boldly recognize the two needs in question, and proceed candidly to give them their proper satisfaction. The need of information, the legitimate curiosity of boys and girls must be met. 1. Partly by classes on physiology. 2. Partly by private talks and confidences between elder and younger, based on friendship. With regard to 1, classes of this kind are already happily being carried on at a few advanced schools, and with good results. And though such classes can only go rather generally into the facts of motherhood and generation, they cannot fail, if well managed, to impress the young minds, and give them a far grander and more reverent conception of the matter than they usually gain. But 2, although some rudimentary teaching on sex and lessons in physiology may be given in classes, it is obvious that further instruction, and indeed any real help in the conduct of life and morals, can only come through very close and tender confidences between the elder and the younger, such as exist where there is a strong friendship to begin with. It is obvious that effective help can only come in this way, and that this is the only way in which it is desirable and it should come. The elder friend in this case would, one might say, naturally be, and in many instances may be, the parent, mother, or father, who ought certainly to be able to impress on the clinging child the sacredness of the relation. And it is much to be honored that parents will see their way to take this part more freely in the future. But for some unexplained reason, there is certainly often a gulf of reserve between the British parent and child, and the boy who is much at school comes more under the influence of his elder companions than his parents. If, therefore, boys and youths cannot be trusted and encouraged to form decent and loving friendships with each other, and with their elders or juniors, in which many delicate questions could be discussed, and the tradition of sensible and manly conduct with regard to sex handed down, we are indeed in a bad plight and involved in a vicious circle in which escape seems difficult. And so, we think, the need of attachment must also be met by full recognition of it, and the granting of it expression within all reasonable limits, by the dissemination of a good ideal of friendship and the enlistment of it on the side of manliness and temperance. It is too much to hope that schools will in time recognize comradeship as a regular institution, considerably more important, say, than fagging, an institution having its definite place in the school life, in the games and in the studies, with its own duties, responsibilities, privileges, etc., and serving to ramify through the little community, hold it together, and inspire its members with the two qualities of heroism and tenderness, which together form the basis of all great character. But here it must be said that if we are hoping for any great change in the conduct of our large boys' schools, the so-called public schools are not the place in which to look for it, or at any rate for its inception. In the first place, these institutions are hampered by powerful traditions, which naturally make them conservative. And in the second place, their mere size and number of boys make them difficult to deal with or to modify. The masters are overwhelmed with work, and the necessary division of so many boys into separate houses has this effect that a master who introduces a better tradition into his own house has always the prospect before him that his work will be effaced by the continual and perhaps contaminating contact with the boys from the other houses. No, it will be in smaller schools, say of from 50 to 100 boys, where the personal influence of the headmaster will be a real force reaching each boy, and where he will be able to mold the tradition of the school, that we shall alone be able to look for an improved state of affairs. Footnote: with the rapid rise which is taking place in scope and social status of the state day schools, it is probable that some change of opinion will take place with regard to the wisdom of sending young boys of 10 to 14 to upper-class boarding schools. For a boy of 15 or 16 and upwards, the boarding school system may have its advantages. By that time, a boy is old enough to understand some questions. He is old enough to have some rational ideal of conduct, and to hold his own in the pursuit of it. And he may learn in the life away from home a lot in the way of discipline, organization, self-reliance, etc. But to send a young thing, ignorant of life and quite unformed of character, to take his chance by day and night in the public school as it presently exists, is, to say the least, a rash thing to do. End footnote. No doubt, the first steps in any reform of this kind are difficult, but masters are greatly hampered by the confusion in the public mind, to which we have already alluded, which so often persists in setting down any attachment between two boys or between a boy and his teacher to nothing but sensuality. Many masters quite understand the situation, but feel themselves helpless in the face of public opinion. Who so fit, they sometimes feel, to enlighten a young boy and guide his growing mind as one of themselves, when the bond of attachment exists between the two? Like the writer of a letter quoted in the early part of this paper, they believe that, quote, a personal affection, almost indescribable, grows up between pupil and teacher, through which thoughts are shared and an influence created that could exist in no other way. End quote. Yet when the pupil comes along of whom all this might be true, who shows by his pleading looks the sentiment which animates him, and the profound impression which he is longing, as it were, to receive from his teacher, the latter belies him, denies his own instinct and the boy's great need, and treats him distantly and with coldness. And why? Simply because he dreads, even while he desires it, the boy's confidence. He fears the ingenious and perfectly natural expression of the boy's affection in caress or embrace, because he knows how a bastard public opinion will interpret it, or misinterpret it. And rather than run such a risk as this, he steals the fountains of the heart, withholds the help which love alone can give, and deliberately nips the tender bud which is turning to him for light and warmth. Footnote. It should be said in fairness that the fear of showing undue partiality often comes in as a paralyzing influence. End footnote. The panic terror which prevails in England with regard to the expression of affection of this kind has its comic aspect. The affection exists, and is known to exist on all sides, but we must bury our heads in the sand and pretend not to see it. And if by any chance we are compelled to recognize it, we must show our vast disconcertment by suspecting it. And thus we fling on the dust heap one of the noblest and most precious elements in human nature. Certainly, if the denial and suspicion of all natural affection were beneficial, we should find this out in our schools. But seeing how complete is its failure there to clarify their tone, it is sufficiently evident that the method itself is wrong. The remarks on this paper have chiefly had reference to boys' schools, but they apply in the main to girls' schools, where much the same troubles prevail, with this difference, that in girls' schools, friendships, instead of being repressed, are rather encouraged by public opinion. Only unfortunately, they are, for the most part, friendships of a weak and sentimental turn, and not very healthy either in themselves, or in the habits they lead to. Here, too, in girls' schools, the whole subject wants facing out. Friendship wants setting on a more solid and less sentimental basis, and on the subject of sex, so infinitely important to women, there needs to be sensible and consistent teaching, both public and private. Possibly the coeducation of boys and girls may be of use in making boys less ashamed of their feelings, and girls more healthy in the expression of them. At any rate, the more the matter is thought of, the clearer I believe it will appear that a healthy affection must in the end be the basis of education, and that the recognition of this will form the only way out of the modern school difficulty. It is true that such a change would revolutionize our school life, but it will have to come all the same, and no doubt will come pari passu with other changes that are taking place in society at large. End of Chapter 4. Chapter 5 of the Intermediate Sex, a study of some transitional types of men and women. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit librivox.org. Recording by Chuck Williamson. The Intermediate Sex, a study of some transitional types of men and women. By Edward Carpenter. Chapter 5. The Place of the Uranian in Society. Whatever differing views there may be on the many problems which the intermediate sexes present, and however difficult of solution some of the questions involved, there is one thing which appears to me incontestable, namely, that a vast number of intermediates do actually perform most valuable social work, and that they do so partly on account and by reason of their special temperament. This fact is not generally recognized as it ought to be, for the simple reason that the Uranian himself is not recognized, and indeed, as we have already said, tends to conceal his temperament from the public. There is no doubt that if it became widely known who are the Uranians, the world would be astonished to find so many of its great or leading men among them. I have thought it might be useful to indicate some of the lines along which valuable work is being performed, or has been performed, by people of this disposition. And in doing this, I do not, of course, mean to disguise or conceal the fact that there are numbers of merely frivolous or feeble or even vicious homosexuals who practically do no useful work for society at all, just as there are of normal people. The existence of those who do no valuable work does not alter the fact of the existence of others whose work is of great importance. And I wish also to make it clearly understood that I use the word Uranians to indicate simply those whose lives and activities are inspired by a genuine friendship or love for their own sex, without venturing to specify their individual and particular habits or relations towards those whom they love, which relations, in most cases, we have no means of knowing. Some intermediates of light and leading, doubtless not a few, are physically very reserved and continent. Others are sensual in some degree or other. The point is that they are all men or women whose most powerful motive comes from the dedication to their own kind, and is bound up with it in some way. And if it seems strange and anomalous that in such cases work of considerable importance to society is being done by people whose affections and dispositions society itself would blame, this is, after all, no more than has happened 1,000 times before in the history of the world. As I have already hinted, the Uranian temperament, notably from the very fact of its dual nature and the swift and constant interaction between its masculine and feminine elements, is exceedingly sensitive and emotional, and there is no doubt that, going with this, a large number of the artist class, musical, literary, or pictorial, belong to this description. That delicate and subtle sympathy with every wave and phase of feeling which makes the artist possible is also very characteristic of the Uranian, the male type, and makes it easy or natural for the Uranian man to become an artist. In the confessions and cases collected by Krafft-Ebing, Havelock Ellis, and others, it is remarkable what a large percentage of men of this temperament belong to the artist class. In his volume on sexual inversion, speaking of the cases collected by himself, Ellis says, quote, "An examination of my cases reveals the interesting fact that 32 of them, or 68%, possess artistic aptitude in varying degree. Galton found from the investigation of nearly 1,000 persons that the general average showing artistic taste in England is about 30%. It must also be said that my figures are probably below the truth, as no special point was made of investigating the matter, and also that in many of my cases the artistic aptitudes are of high order. With regard to the special avocations of my cases, it must of course be said that no occupation furnishes a safeguard against inversion. There are, however, certain occupations to which inverts are specially attracted. Acting is certainly one of the chief of these. 3 of my cases belong to the dramatic profession, and others have marked dramatic ability. Art, again, in its various forms, and music exercise much attraction. In my experience, however, literature is the avocation to which inverts seem to feel chiefly called, and that, moreover, in which they may find the highest degree of success and reputation. At least 6 of my cases are successful men of letters." End quote. Of literature in this connection, and of the great writers of the world whose work has been partly inspired by the Uranian love, I have myself already spoken. It may further be said that those of the modern artist writers and poets who have done the greatest service in the way of interpreting and reconstructing Greek life and ideals, men like Winckelmann, Goethe, Addison Symonds, Walter Pater, have had a marked strain of this temperament in them. And this has been a service of great value, and one which the world could ill have afforded to lose. The painters and sculptors, especially of the Renaissance period in Italy, yield not a few examples of men whose work has been similarly inspired, as in the cases of Michelangelo, Leonardo, Bazzi, Cellini, and others. As to music, this is certainly the art which, in its subtlety and tenderness, and perhaps in a certain inclination to indulge in emotion, lies nearest to the earning nature. There are few, in fact, of this nature who have not some gift in the direction of music, though, unless we cite Tchaikovsky, it does not appear that any thoroughgoing Uranian has attained to the highest eminence in this art. Another direction along which the temperament very naturally finds an outlet is the important social work of education. The capacity that a man has in cases of devoting himself to the welfare of boys or youths is clearly a thing which ought not to go wasted, and which may be most precious and valuable. It is incontestable that a great number of men and women are drawn into the teaching profession by this sentiment, and the work they do in many cases beyond estimation. Fortunate the boy who meets with such a helper in early life. I know a man, a rising and vigorous thinker and writer, who tells me that he owes almost everything mentally to such a friend of his boyhood, who took the greatest interest in him, saw him almost every day for many years, and indeed cleared up for him not only many things mental, but things moral, giving him the affection and guidance his young heart needed. And I have myself known and watched not a few such teachers, in public schools and in private schools, and seen something of the work and of the real inspiration they have been to boys under them. Hampered as they have been by the readiness of the world to misinterpret, they still have been able to do most precious service. Of course, here and there a case occurs in which privilege is abused. But even then, the judgment of the world is often unreasonably severe. A poor boy once told me with tears in his eyes of the work a man had done for him. The man had saved the boy from drunken parents, taken him from the slums, and by means of a club, helped him out into the world. Many other boys he had rescued, it appeared, in the same way, scores and scores of them. But on some occasion or other he got into trouble, and was accused of improper familiarities. No excuse or record of a useful life was of the least avail. Every trumpery slander was believed, every mean motive imputed, and he had to throw up his position and settle elsewhere, his life work shattered, never to be resumed. The capacity for sincere affection, which causes an elder man to care so deeply for the welfare of a youth or boy, is met and responded to by a similar capacity in the young thing of devotion to an elder man. This fact is not always recognized, but I have known cases of boys and even young men who would feel the most romantic attachments to quite mature men, sometimes as much as 40 or 50 years of age, and only for them, passing by their own contemporaries of either sex, and caring only to win a return affection from these others. This may seem strange, but it is true, and the fact not only makes one understand what riddles there are slumbering in the breasts of our children, but how greatly important it is that we should try to read them, since here, in such cases as these, the finding of an answering heart in an elder man would probably be the younger one's salvation. How much of the enormous amount of philanthropic work done in the present day, by women among needy and destitute girls of all sorts, or by men along like classes of boys, is inspired by the same feeling, it would be hard to say, but it must be a very considerable proportion. I think myself that the best philanthropic work, just because it is the most personal, the most loving, and the least merely formal and self-righteous, has a strong fiber of the Uranian heart running through it. And if it should be said that work of this very personal kind is more liable to dangers and difficulties on that account, it is only what is true of the best in almost all departments. Eros is a great leveler, Perhaps the true democracy rests more firmly than anywhere else on a sentiment which easily passes the bounds of class and caste, and unites in the closest affection the most estranged ranks of society. It is noticeable how often Uranians of good position and breeding are drawn to rougher types, as of manual workers, and frequently very permanent alliances grow up in this way, which, although not publicly acknowledged, have a decided influence on social institutions, customs, and political tendencies, and which would have a good deal more influence could they be given a little scope and recognition. There are cases that I have known, although the ordinary commercial world might hardly believe it, of employers who have managed to attach their workmen, or many of them, very personally to themselves, and whose object in running their businesses was at least as much to provide their employees with a living as themselves, while the latter, feeling this, have responded with their best output. It is possible that something like the guilds and fraternities of the Middle Ages might thus be reconstructed, but on a more intimate and personal basis than in those days. And indeed, there are not wanting signs that such a reconstruction is actually taking place. The letters of love and labor, written by Samuel M. Jones of Toledo, Ohio, to his workmen in the engineering firm of which he was master, are very interesting in this connection. They breathe a spirit of extraordinary personal affection towards and confidence in the employees, which was heartily responded to by the latter, and the whole business was carried on with considerable success on the principle of a close and friendly cooperation all round. These things indeed suggest to one that it is possible that the Uranian spirit may lead to something like a general enthusiasm of humanity, and that the Uranian people may be destined to form the advance guard of that great movement which will one day transform the common life by substituting the bond of personal affection and compassion for the monetary, legal, and other external ties which now control and confine society. Such a part, of course, we cannot expect the Uranians to play unless the capacity for their kind of attachment also exists, though in a germinal and undeveloped state, in the breast of mankind at large, and modern thought and investigation are clearly tending that way, to confirm that it does so exist. Dr. E. Baertz, in his late study of Whitman as a person of strongly homogenic temperament, brings forward the objection that Whitman's gospel of comradeship as a means of social regeneration is founded on a false basis, because, so Dr. Baertz says, the gospel derives from an abnormality in himself, and therefore cannot possibly have a universal application or create a general enthusiasm. But this is rather a case of assuming the point which has to be proved. Whitman constantly maintains that his own disposition at any rate is normal, and that he represents the average man. And it may be true, even as far as his Uranian temperament is concerned, that while this was specially developed in him, the germs of it are almost, if not quite, universal. If so, then the comradeship on which Whitman founds a large portion of his message may in course of time become a general enthusiasm, and the nobler Uranians of today may be destined, as suggested, to be its pioneers in advance guard. As one of them himself has sung, quote, "These things shall be, A loftier race than e'er the world hath known shall rise with flame of freedom in their souls and light of science in their eyes. Nation with nation, land with land, in arms shall live as comrades free. In every heart and brain shall throb the pulse of one fraternity. End quote. To proceed, the Uranian, though generally high-strung and sensitive, is by no means always dreamy. He is sometimes extraordinarily and unexpectedly practical, and such a man may, as often does, command a positive enthusiasm among his subordinates in a business organization. The same is true of military organization. As a rule, the Uranian temperament in the male is not militant. War, with its horrors and savagery, is somewhat alien to the type. But here again there are exceptions. And in all times there have been great generals, like Alexander, Caesar, Charles XII of Sweden, or Frederick II of Prussia, not to speak of more modern examples, with a powerful strain in them of the homogenic nature, and a wonderful capacity for organization and command, which, combined with their personal interest in or attachment to their troops, and the answering enthusiasm so elicited, have made their armies well nigh invincible. The existence of this great practical ability in some Uranians cannot be denied, and it points to the important work they may some day have to do in social reconstruction. At the same time, I think, it is noticeable that politics, at any rate in the modern sense of the word, as concerned mainly with party questions and party government, is not as a rule congenial to them. The personal and affectional element is perhaps too remote or absent. Mere views and questions and party strife are alien to the Uranian man, as they are on the whole to the ordinary woman. If politics, however, are not particularly congenial, it is yet remarkable how many royal personages have been decidedly homogenic in temperament. Taking the kings of England, from the Norman conquest to the present day, we may count about 30, and 3 of these, namely William Rufus, Edward II, and James I, were homosexual in a marked degree, might fairly be classed as Urnings, while some others, like William III, had a strong admixture of the same temperament. 3 out of 30 yields a high ratio, 10%, and considering that sovereigns do not generally choose themselves, but come into their position by accident of birth, the ratio is certainly remarkable. Does it suggest that the general percentage in the world at large is equally high, but that it remains unnoticed, except in the fierce light that beats upon thrones? Or is there some other explanation with regard to the special liability of royalty to inversion? Hereditary degeneracy has sometimes been suggested, but it is difficult to explain the matter even on this theory. For though the epithet degenerate might possibly apply to James I, it would certainly not be applicable to William Rufus and William III, who, in their different ways, were both men of great courage and personal force, while Edward II was by no means wanting in ability. But while the Uranian temperament has, in cases, specially fitted its possessors to become distinguished in art or education or war or administration, and enabled them to do valuable work in these fields, it remains perhaps true that above all It has fitted them and fits them for distinction and service in affairs of the heart. It is hard to imagine human beings more skilled in these matters than the intermediates. No one else can possibly respond to and understand as they do all the fluctuations and interactions of the masculine and feminine in human life. The pretensive coyness and passivity of women, the rude invasiveness of men, lust, brutality, secret tears, the bleeding heart, renunciation, motherhood, finesse, romance, angelic devotion. All these things lie slumbering in the Uranian soul, ready on occasion for expression. And if they are not always expressed, are always there for purposes of divination or interpretation. There are few situations, in fact, in courtship or marriage, which the Uranian does not instinctively understand. And it is strange to see how even an unlettered person of this type will often read love's manuscript easily, in cases where the normal man or woman is groping over it like a child in the dark. Not, of course, that this means to imply any superiority of character in the former, but merely that with his double outlook, he necessarily discerns things which the other misses. That the Uranians do stand out as helpers and guides, not only in matters of education, but in matters of love and marriage, is tolerably patent to all who know them. It is a common experience for them to be consulted now by the man, now by the woman, whose matrimonial conditions are uncongenial or disastrous. Not generally because the consultants in the least perceive the Uranian nature, but because they instinctively feel that here is a strong sympathy with and understanding of their side of the question. In this way, it is often the fate of the Uranian, himself unrecognized, to bring about happier times and a better comprehension of each other among those with whom he may have to deal. And he often becomes the confidant of young things of either sex, who are caught in the tangles of love or passion and know not where to turn for assistance. I say that I think perhaps of all the services the Uranian may render to society, it will be found some day that in this direction of solving the problems of affection and of the heart, he will do the greatest service. If the day is coming, as we have suggested, when love is at last to take its rightful place as the binding and directing force of society, instead of the cash nexus, and society is to be transmuted in consequence to a higher form, then undoubtedly the superior types of Uranians, prepared for this service by long experience and devotion, as well as by much suffering, will have an important part to play in the transformation. For that the earnings in their own lives put love before everything else, postponing to it other motives like money-making, business success, fame, which occupies so much space in most people's careers, is a fact which is patent to everyone who knows them. This may be saying little or nothing in favor of those of this class whose conception of love is only of a poor and frivolous sort, but in the case of those others who see the God in his true light, the fact that they serve him in singleness of heart and so unremittingly raises them at once into the position of the natural leaders of mankind. From this fact, i.e., that these folk think so much of affairs of the heart, and from the fact that their alliances and friendships are formed and carried on beneath the surface of society, as it were, and therefore to some extent beyond the inquisitions and supervisions of Mrs. Grundy, some interesting conclusions flow. For one thing, the question is constantly arising of how society would shape itself if free. What form in matters of love and marriage would it take if the present restrictions and sanctions were removed or greatly altered? At present in these matters, the law, the church, and a strong pressure of public opinion interfere, compelling the observance of certain forms. And it becomes difficult to say how much of the existing order is due to the spontaneous instinct and common sense of human nature, and how much to outside compulsion and interference. How far, for instance, monogamy is natural or artificial? To what degree marriage would be permanent if the law did not make it so? What is the rational view of divorce? Whether jealousy is a necessary accompaniment of love, and so forth. These are questions which are being constantly discussed, without finality, or not infrequently with quite pessimistic conclusions. Now, in the earning societies, a certain freedom, though not complete of course, exists. Underneath the surface of general society, and consequently unaffected to any great degree by its laws and customs, alliances are formed and maintained, or modified or broken, more in accord with inner need than with outer pressure. Thus it happens that in these societies there are such opportunities to note and observe human grouping under conditions of freedom as do not occur in the ordinary world. And the results are both interesting and encouraging. As a rule, I think it may be said that the alliances are remarkably permanent. Instead of the wild general post which so many good people seem to expect in the event of law being relaxed, one finds, except of course in a few individual cases, that common sense and fidelity and a strong tendency to permanence prevail. In the ordinary world, so far has doubt gone that many today disbelieve in a lifelong free marriage. Yet among the Uranians, such a thing is, one may almost say, common and quite well known. Common and well known. And there are certainly few among them who do not believe in its possibility. Great have been the debates, in all times and places, concerning jealousy, and as to how far jealousy is natural and instinctive and universal, and how far it is the product of social opinion and the property sense, and so on. In ordinary marriage, what may be called social and proprietary jealousy is undoubtedly a very great factor. But this kind of jealousy hardly appears or operates in the earning societies. Thus, we have an opportunity in these latter of observing conditions where only the natural and instinctive jealousy exists. This, of course, is present among the earnings, sometimes rampant and violent, sometimes quiescent and vanishing almost to nil. It seems to depend almost entirely upon the individual. And we certainly learn that jealousy, though frequent and widespread, is not an absolute necessary accompaniment of love. There are cases of Uranians, whether men or women, who, though permanently allied, do not object to lesser friendships on either side. And there are cases of very decided objection. And we may conclude that something the same would be true, is true, of the ordinary marriage, the property considerations and the property jealousy being once removed. The tendency, anyhow, to establish a dual relation more or less fixed is seen to be very strong among the intermediates, and may be concluded to be equally strong among the more normal folk. Again, with regard to prostitution, that there are a few natural-born prostitutes is seen in the earning societies, but prostitution in that world does not take the important place which it does in the normal world. partly because the law-bound compulsory marriage does not exist there, and partly because prostitution naturally has very little chance and cannot compete in a world where alliances are free and there is an open field for friendship. Hence, we may see that freedom of alliance and of marriage in the ordinary world will probably lead to the great diminution or even disappearance of prostitution. In these and other ways, the experience of the Uranian world forming itself freely and not subject to outside laws and institutions comes as a guide, and really a hopeful guide, towards the future. I would say, however, that in making these remarks about certain conclusions which we are about to gather from some spontaneous and comparatively unrestricted associations, I do not at all mean to argue against institutions and forms. I think that the Uranian love undoubtedly suffers from want of a recognition and a standard. And though it may at present be better off than if subject to a foolish and meddlesome regulation, it will have its more or less fixed standards and ideals, like the normal love. If one considers for a moment how the ordinary relations of the sexes would suffer were there no generally acknowledged codes of honor and conduct with regard to them, one would indeed see that reasonable forms and institutions are a help. And one may almost wonder that the earning circles are so well conducted on the whole as they are. I have said that the earning men in their own lives put love before money-making, business success, fame, and other motives which rule the normal man. I am sure that it is also true of them as a whole that they put love before lust. I do not feel sure that this could be said of the normal man, at any rate in the present stage of evolution. It is doubtful whether on the whole the merely physical attraction is not the stronger motive with the latter type. Unwilling as the world at large is to credit what I am about to say, and great as are the current misunderstandings on the subject, I believe it is true that the Uranian men are superior to the normal men in this respect, in respect of their love-feeling, which is gentler, more sympathetic, more considerate, more a matter of the heart and less one of mere physical satisfaction than of the ordinary men. All this flows naturally from the presence of the feminine element in them, and its blending with the rest of their nature. It should be expected a priori, and it can be noticed at once by those who have any acquaintance with the earning world. Much of the current misunderstanding with regard to the character and habits of the earning arises from the confusion with the ordinary roux, who, though of normal temperament, contracts homosexual habits out of curiosity and so forth. But this is a point which I have touched on before, and which ought now to be sufficiently clear. If it be once allowed that the love nature of the Uranian is of a sincere and essentially humane and kindly type, then the importance of the Uranian's place in society, and of the social work he may be able to do, must certainly also be acknowledged. End of Chapter 5. End of the Intermediate Sex, a study of some transitional types of men and women, by Edward Carpenter. Recording by Chuck Williamson, 2021. Thank you for listening.